Former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani and the current New York City police and fire commissioners testified on the lessons learned from the attacks and the country's current readiness to prevent and respond to terrorism. Mr. Giuliani was mayor of New York City at the time of the attacks 14 years ago. This is the House Homeland Security Committee field hearing at the National September 11 Memorial and Museum in New York City.
Check that black case right now.
Can't issue me. Good. Yeah, it's really good. That ground zero. The Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce Joe Daniels, the President and CEO of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum. Joe.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman McCall, and thank you to all the committee members for being here this morning and choosing to hold this field hearing at this location. This is the very first time we are hosting such an event at the National September 11th Memorial and Museum. And I, on behalf of the organization, our board of directors, and the hundreds of thousands of people who worked to make this place a reality, thank you for your support and perhaps more importantly, your steadfast commitment by the members of this committee in working to secure the safety of our nation, which is especially profound given our current location at the very foundations where the towers once stood. I had the honor of giving some of you a tour of the space last night, and I think we can all agree that this site holds great importance with regards to the topics that will be discussed this morning. I'd also like to thank some of our partner organizations who are here in attendance, including Tuesday's Children, the 9/11 Tribute Center, along with representatives from the September 11th Education Trust and the 9/11 Health Watch. It is, of course, fitting and appropriate to acknowledge that in just a few days, the memorial will host once again the solemn ceremony marking the anniversary of the attacks, this year the 14th anniversary. This anniversary is, of course, significant for all of us, for the entire nation, but particularly for the victims' families, as well as the first responders, the recovery workers, survivors, and all others impacted by the attacks, including those who are still dealing with the lingering and devastating health effects so many years later. On the 10th anniversary, just 4 years ago this week, we opened the memorial, and since then we've welcomed over 21 million visitors from every state in the country and 175 countries around the world, making this one of the most visited historical sites in our country. And just last year, we opened this museum with a dedication ceremony here in this foundation hall and have seen a tremendous outpouring of positive feedback. In just over a year, we've welcomed more than 3.5 million visitors to the museum. In addition to the general public, we've had visitors from across the political, cultural, and military spectrum. But for every visit, from Prince William and the Duchess of Cambridge and various heads of state, the most meaningful visits have been from the nearly 75,000 active military and veterans, including 3 recent Medal of Honor winners, the former U.S. Army Chief of Staff Ray Odierno, along with several 4-stars from his team. And last September, we had the entire Corps of West Point cadets on the 9/11 Memorial. Later this month, and in this very room where we're sitting right now, we will host one of the most important and beloved figures in the world. Pope Francis will lead a multi-religious meeting for peace, speaking about the idea of what unites us being stronger than what divides. And for a group of religious leaders will be with him that represent all of the world's major religions. This memorial and museum not only serves as a place for people from all walks of life to visit and pay their respects, but also as a place where future generations will learn about what happened that day, what led up to that day, and the increasingly complex state of world affairs. Let's not forget that children now entering high school were born after 9/11/2001, and for them, we risk that 9/11 is simply an historical fact. It is to this institution where thousands of educators bring their students every single year to learn the full history of 9/11. That's why I would like to thank Chairman McCall, Representatives King and Jackson Lee for already being co-sponsors of the bill H.R. 3036, the National 9/11 Memorial at the World Trade Center Act, which would designate the above-ground, beautiful memorial as a true national memorial. Those beautiful pools will ensure that this place is here to preserve the memory of those who were killed, and will make sure that we fulfill our obligation to educate future generations. I would very, very much encourage from the bottom of my heart that all members of this committee, this incredibly important committee, support H.R. 3036, as this is a momentous opportunity to take the lead in preserving the memory of one of the most important events in the entire history of the United States. This memorial has truly become not only the location to remember and educate, but is the physical embodiment of the unity, the coming together that was so prevalent in the aftermath of the attacks. Thank you for your time here today and for your continued support.
Well, thank you, Joe. And on behalf of the committee, let me thank you for your dedication, your service to the victims and their families. Let us never forget, and may it never happen again. And I was inspired at our dinner last night to hear from you and your efforts. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of the legislation that you talked about. And again, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you.
I think it's fitting that this committee be the first committee to convene at the 9/11 Museum. This committee was formed in response to the tragic events of 9/11. This is a historic event to have the Committee on Homeland Security have this hearing in this museum at this time this week. I'd like to thank the 9/11 Memorial Museum for letting us hold the hearing today. I'd also like to thank Mayor Giuliani and the other witnesses for taking the time to join us and for their service to this great city and to our country. This morning we are meeting on hallowed ground, consecrated by the loss of thousands of innocent Americans and by the valor and sacrifice of those who worked to save their lives. In the wake of 9/11, we were told to never forget, and we did not. In their honor, we vowed never again. Our memories of the heroism we witnessed gave our nation the resolve needed to embark on a generational struggle against Islamist terror. 14 years after that fateful day, we are still engaged in that struggle, though we have entered a new phase. The viral speed of violent extremism has allowed our enemies to spread globally and has brought the war back to our doorsteps. But we will not bow down to terror. So we have come here today to draw on the lessons we learned after 9/11, to assess how we can make our country more secure, and to honor the memory of those we lost by rededicating ourselves to victory in this long war. We have made progress since 9/11, which was the largest attack in world history. Our first responders are better equipped. Our intelligence professionals are connecting the dots, and our border authorities are keeping terrorists from stepping foot on our soil. But our enemies have come a long way. Gone are the days of bin Laden, when extremists relied on couriers and caves to hatch their plots. Today's terrorists are openly recruiting online, across borders, and at broadband speed. Radical groups like ISIS have enlisted citizens from over 100 countries to join their terrorist army in Syria, and Islamist terror outposts has spread throughout the region and beyond. This includes Iran, the world's largest state sponsor of terror, which has extended its reach. And the results are alarming. Last year was the deadliest year on record for global terrorism, and terrorists still have their sights set on the West. In fact, in the past 18 months, ISIS alone has inspired or directed nearly 60 plots or attacks against Western countries, including America. Authorities have also arrested an average of almost 1 American per week on terrorism charges. We are in uncharted territory. Even at its height, al-Qaeda never reached this kind of operational tempo. Yet in an age of peer-to-peer terrorism and cyber jihad, extremists can inspire new recruits online, tweet marching orders, and wait for fanatics to act. Their followers can also travel easily to join them overseas, where they are trained to wage war. But even though our adversaries evolved, the battle-tested principles we learned from 9/11 are still relevant. First, we must remain vigilant. The 9/11 Commission found a government-wide failure of imagination contributed to the surprise attack. So we must prepare for the worst and stay a step ahead of the threat. We must also take the fight to the enemy before they can attack us here at home. And we can do this by eliminating terrorist sanctuaries overseas. Condoleezza Rice noted wisely, if we learned anything from September the 11th, it is that we cannot wait while dangers gather. In 2004, the 9/11 Commission made the same point with an ominous prediction when they said, quote, if, for example, Iraq becomes a failed state, they wrote, it will go to the top of the list of places that are breeding grounds for attacks against Americans at home. And if we are paying insufficient attention to Afghanistan, its countryside could once again offer refuge to al-Qaeda or its successor. The lesson is clear. We must not let power vacuums develop in new places like Libya or in old safe havens like Afghanistan. Terrorists must be kept on the run, or else they will build larger armies and have the freedom to plot against us in relative safety. 9/11 also taught us that in the long term, we must counter the ideology at the core of Islamist terror, because when left unchecked, it can spread to all corners of the globe in the same way communism and fascism led to decades of destruction. I hope we will have a chance to examine these principles today and how to follow them in a new age of terror. But I also hope we can explore what the resolve of our 9/11 heroes can teach us about prevailing against those who seek to do America harm. On that day, we saw the face of evil as terrorists sought to attack our economic, military, and political centers of power. But we also saw the true heart of America as ordinary men and women showed uncommon courage. First responders and pedestrians rushed into burning buildings and stormed cockpits to save one another. There were Americans with children, families, but they did not hesitate because they knew the people inside these buildings and with them on those airplanes had families too. Driven by common humanity, they knowingly put their lives in the hands of God. And their bravery has rightly earned them a certain measure of immortality. He did not know it at the time, but when Todd Beamer said, "Let's roll," to his fellow passengers, he was leading them and us to the first victory in the war against Islamist terror. And the day after, we were still reeling, but our nation came together. We were Americans first, and even though we were uncertain about what the future held, we were united in our resilience to tragedy and in our resolve to deliver justice. The column behind us here today is the final piece of debris removed from the World Trade Center site. And those who cleared the rubble inscribed it with the names, stories, and photos of people who perished, as well as the symbols of patriotism. So it is fitting that this last piece of the lower tower's wreckage now stands here as a permanent symbol of remembrance and resilience. We are a country that did not invite aggression from dark corners of the globe. But when it came to our shores, confidence and hope, not fear, rose from those ashes. I want to thank everyone for being here today on this solemn occasion. I want to thank the witnesses, and the chair now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank New Yorkers in particular for allowing us to hold this hearing here. Every time I come to this place, I'm always overwhelmed, mostly because I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time in my earlier career here in the Twin Tower buildings. In fact, my former husband's office was here, and because I was in the financial industry, we had plenty of friends at Cantor Fitzgerald. So every time I come here, I remember all those innocent people who were taken on that day. I want to thank our panelists for being here today. I want to say that I'm very proud of New Yorkers and Americans, because seeing this here today reminds me of just how resilient we are, how resilient everything I know in the time that I've spent in this city, New Yorkers are. And it is really a testament to our ability to never forget, but to understand that the future is what we look forward to as Americans. So since 9/11, we have changed our policing, and we've changed the way that we engage our communities in order to prevent terrorist attacks. And this committee has been on the forefront of trying to understand that and to help locals in particular, because we know that you are the first responders. I believe that law enforcement has become a great community facilitator, engaging in all facets of the cities that they patrol. And I see that they do it at a time, Mr. Chairman, when we are cutting back on the federal funds that we send to the local jurisdictions. In fact, it's been a little alarming to me that the Congress has cut back on the funds. For example, in 2011, Congress reduced the funding to only $1.9 billion to our local agencies. And as a result of that, 32 cities were eliminated from the UWASI program, for example. In the following year, we appropriated only $1.35 billion to these important programs. And then we increased it a little bit, then we brought it back down again, and because of sequestration, we are looking again at cuts to our local law enforcement agencies for all the work that they have taken on in particular since 9/11. I'm also interested, I'd like to hear from the locals about how that budget uncertainty, the amount of money that we put forward, does with respect to their programs, and what you're really trying to do to ensure that a 9/11 or a Boston bombing doesn't happen. And beyond dealing with that, I would like to hear about what you're doing with your local communities, including, for example, I represent the second largest Arab American community in our nation back in Orange County, California. And I think that it's critical that we don't profile, that we don't unduly harass, and that we don't detain individuals simply because of how they look or what their religion is. So I would like to hear from you in particular, Commissioner Bratton, on how the New York Police Department engages communities such as Muslim Americans, especially after it was revealed that plainclothes detectives went into Muslim neighborhoods to spy on that specific community, at least according to your New York Times. I understand that the NYPD dropped that program, but I'd like to hear about how you're rebuilding that relationship and that trust with a community that we need to have on our side to help us with respect to local terrorism plots. And I look forward to hearing from both panels, and I want to thank again the chairman for holding the hearing. I think that we have come a long way since 9/11, and that we still have a ways to go. But again, I am always amazed at the resiliency of our people and at the resiliency of New Yorkers. And I look forward to the testimony. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Other members are reminded opening statements may be submitted for the record. We're pleased to have two distinguished panels of witnesses before us here today. The first, the former mayor of New York, Mayor Rudy Giuliani, will testify on the first panel, and the second will consist of Mr. William Bratton, Commissioner of the New York Police Department, and Mr. Daniel Nigro, the Commissioner of the Fire Department for the City of New York, and Mr. Lee Ielpi, the President of September 11th Families Association, and finally Mr. Gregory Thomas, President of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives and Senior Executive for Law Enforcement Operation in the Office of Kings County District Attorney. Let me first introduce the mayor, and if you would have a seat at the table. Mayor Rudy Giuliani serves as a partner at Bracewell and Giuliani and as chairman of the Chief Executive Officer of Giuliani Partners. Previously, Mayor Giuliani served 2 terms as New York City's mayor from 1994 to 2001 and led the city during and in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. I can't think of a more important witness to be here today than you, sir, and we thank you for your service both before but particularly after 9/11. Where you brought, out of such a tragedy, brought this country together, sir, and it's with great honor that we have you, and I now yield to you for your testimony.
Mr. Chairman, it's a great honor for me to be here. Mr. Chairman, it's a great honor for me to be here. I thank the committee for holding the hearing here. As you said, there could be no more appropriate place. This is not just a museum, this is sacred ground. There are people buried here who were never recovered. This is a very, very special place, not just to me, but I think to everyone. When I look at the wall behind you, I think of the days and weeks in which we worried that that wall wouldn't hold and this whole place would be flooded. We expended a great deal of time, energy, and money in trying to prevent that. And then probably most of all, I think of all the caskets and people that were carried out here with American flags draped on them in great solemn procession. And I think of Father Judge, who was the first body that we found here at September 11, who was brought to St. Peter's Church. And remember his last words to me about 8 minutes before he died, which was, God bless us. So maybe we should begin that way, with God blessing us. This museum is many, many things. And you will hear how one of the most important missions of this museum is so that people never forget. And that is truly the case. They should not, because we do have a tendency to repeat the mistakes of history. We've done that in the 20th century several times in de-arming after each war and then facing another war that we weren't prepared for. Hopefully we won't make those mistakes again, and the reminder of what happened here will remind us of the fact that we face a very implacable and difficult foe. The first point I would like to make is a point that I made very shortly after September 11, and that is that the Islamic terrorist war against us did not begin on September 11, 2001. I remind you this very place was attacked in 1993, again by Islamic terrorists who were taught their terrorism in a mosque in Union City, New Jersey, by an imam who is spending 100 years in jail now, sentenced by Judge Michael Mukasey, who eventually became Attorney General. That wasn't the only mosque in New Jersey that was planning attacks on New York. It is unfortunately the case that there is an interpretation of the Islamic religion that calls for the destruction of our way of life. It is certainly not the majority view. It certainly doesn't reflect the views of most people of the Islamic religion. And on the evening of September 11, with the dust of September 11 on my jacket and in my eyes and on my face, I said to the people of New York that we should not view this as an attack by a particular group and assign group blame. That's the worst thing we could do, and that we should not attack anyone. And I said, to the point made by Congresswoman Sanchez, I sent my police commissioner, Bernard Kerik, on the mission of tracking the number of attacks on members of the Arab community in New York. And after 8 days, I stopped doing it because there were none. We expected it. We expected it because of the anger and the hatred. And so to the many things that New Yorkers deserve credit, one of the things they deserve credit for is they don't engage in group blame. But New Yorkers also aren't foolish. And we do realize that although it isn't a matter of group blame, the word profiling has many meanings. If we're profiling based on objective evidence, that is exactly the way we investigate. I was in law enforcement, as you were, for more of my life than anything else, and I caught criminals by profiling. When the victim told me the person was 6'4", had blonde hair and blue eyes, I didn't go look for a 5'4" person with brown eyes and brown hair. If I did, I would have been a fool. I looked for a person that met the description of the people who committed the crime or might commit the crime. The reality is that whatever euphemisms we want to engage in, they are at war with us. By they, I mean Islamic extremist terrorists. They kill in the name of Allah. They kill in the name of Muhammad. They interpret the Quran and the Hadith, which is the explication of the Quran, which I might tell you I have read several times. They interpret it and use those portions of the words of Muhammad that call for death to infidels. Unfortunately, they use mosques as breeding grounds for that. Not all, but some. Congresswoman Sanchez, I'm the mayor who authorized the placement of New York City police officers in mosques in New Jersey and elsewhere, and Mayor Bloomberg continued it. I believe by doing so, I saved the lives of many New Yorkers because we uncovered plots that have never come to light. It's unfortunately the case that has to be done. I believe it was a mistake to withdraw those patrols. So, as we sit in a museum, and when we go to museums, we think of history, don't we? If we were to go to Pearl Harbor and went to the museum in Pearl Harbor, we would think of history, the terrible attack on Pearl Harbor, and the fact that that is now confined to history. Our enemies in those days are now our friends, and some of our best friends. Germany, Italy, Japan. That war's over. We can go to Civil War memorials and we can go to Revolutionary War memorials, some of which are in my great city. And that war is over. You're in a museum about a war that's still going on. And don't fool yourself into thinking that it's over. And is it worse now or better now? Is a very debatable and maybe almost irrelevant issue because it's very bad now. In certain areas, we've improved dramatically: airport security, airline security. Cooperation is considerably better between the federal government and local governments. All of that is true. But the threat remains, and the number of attacks in recent years have increased, and the number of threats have increased. And the enemy has become considerably more diverse, and in that way more difficult to track than when we were facing one major enemy, bin Laden. But we made a mistake then, and I see us making the same mistake again if we're not careful. We made a mistake in not taking seriously what they were saying to us. When they attacked us here in 1993 and killed our people under the orders of an imam from New Jersey, they had declared war on us. We treated it as a criminal act. It wasn't a criminal act like the 5,000 or 6,000 I prosecuted as United States Attorney. It wasn't like the criminal acts of the mafia and Michael Milken and Ivan Boesky and corrupt politicians. And it was an act of war. And then, of course, they attacked us in East Africa and in Africa twice. And then they attacked our USS Cole and killed our service members. By the way, an act of war, usually considered an act of war. We largely ignored those attacks. Our response was tepid. Our response to the USS Cole was non-existent. We allowed American servicemen to be slaughtered by bin Laden, and our reaction was nothing. Just in case we weren't paying attention, bin Laden declared war on us. We weren't paying attention. Did that lead to September 11? Did that lead to a sense of arrogance? And did it lead to a sense of an America that was weak? An America that was unresponsive? An America that could be taken advantage of? No one will ever know. But it's safe to assume it did, because it will protect us better in the future. And then we had September 11. I lost numerous close personal friends, as did many of the people who are sitting here. And it is extraordinarily difficult for me to return here. I've been to this museum only 3 times, and the last time I came with a group of Rangers who were going off on a mission, and their general wanted them to see where the war started, that they are now having to continue. But it didn't start here. It started way before here. The attack on the Munich Olympics was in 1972 on the Israeli team. The killing of Leon Klinghoffer was in the 1980s. We weren't listening, we weren't watching, we weren't paying attention, and we were taking peace dividends while people were declaring war on us. I could trace the history of the aftermath of World War I and World War II and show you the same thing. Only fools repeat the mistakes of history. We're getting all the warnings again. Yes, we have ISIS. ISIS has many causes. Part of it, the withdrawal of our troops from Iraq. Part of it, our unwillingness to engage in Syria. Part of it, the president drawing 12 red lines, saying that if Assad used chemical weapons, he would act, and the president's red lines disappeared, which made America a hollow vessel, a nation one could assume you could take advantage of. You don't draw red lines and then erase them and expect that implacable foes are not going to take advantage of that. So we have ISIS doing things that take you back to the 6th century and the 7th century, to the acts of Ali and some of the followers of Muhammad, beheading of people, mass graves. And our response to ISIS so far has been, at best, to play defense, at worst, to be rather ineffective. One of the great things that President Bush did for us, for which I said at the time, will give him a place in history that can't be denied, is after this attack took place, he immediately put this country on offense. And by putting us on offense, he saved our city from repeated attacks. There is no one, absolutely no one, who on the day of September 11th, FBI or anyone else that briefed me, that didn't warn me that my city was going to be attacked numerous times in the future. And beginning with Commissioner Carrick, continuing through Commissioner Kelly, and now Bratton, New York City has continuously grown its response to terrorism because we expect to be attacked again. But we weren't attacked, and we weren't in large measure because of the bravery of the men and women of our military who went and engaged the enemy in Iraq and Afghanistan and kept them so busy that they couldn't plan attacks. That presence of our military also brought us incalculable amounts of evidence and intelligence warning us about attacks. Consider how that's diminished when those troops aren't there. If you have 100,000 troops in a country, they're in villages, they're in towns, they talk to people, they gather intelligence. That intelligence gets to the CIA, it gets to the FBI, from the Joint Terrorism Task Force, it gets right down here to the streets of the city. That is now gone. We do not have the benefit of that intelligence. Could be part of the reason we thought ISIS or ISIL was the JV, because we weren't getting the intelligence we were getting in the past. It's part of the reason we miscalculated them and let them catch up real fast, and now we're playing catch up, not offense. But ISIS is not the biggest threat to us. A determined, strong strategy of engaging our special forces could do a good job of eliminating ISIS. Our major threat, and let's not take our eye off it as we watch ISIS, is Iran. The Iranian empire that began with the overthrow of the Shah and the first Ayatollah and now the second has killed well over 1 million people. We're talking about mass murderers. The Ayatollah and Prime Minister Rouhani have engaged in mass murder. It's Prime Minister Rouhani who was one who ordered the execution of the Jewish people in Argentina. There are more people being killed in Iran today than under Ahmadinejad, for a very important reason. The Ayatollah and Rouhani do not want the people inside of Iran to drink the Kool-Aid of thinking that there's a reform going on in Iran. They're trying to get us to drink that Kool-Aid, but they're killing people to remind their people, we control Iran. So let's not take our eye off Iran. And let's remember that we're negotiating with an Ayatollah who has pronounced the destruction of the state of Israel, the death of Americans, and has on his hands the blood of very, very many young Americans who were killed by the Quds forces during the war in Iraq. And we're negotiating with him. At the same time, we're negotiating with him, and he's calling for our death and destruction. We're not calling for regime change in Iran. If they can have a two-part strategy in negotiating, why are we so unsophisticated that we can't have a two-part strategy? If the Ayatollah can negotiate with us and call for our death and destruction, then why can't we negotiate with him and call for regime change in Iran? If Egypt needed regime change, and we supported it, and overthrew Mubarak, a friend of the United States and a friend of Israel, if we supported regime change in Iran and removed Gaddafi, who had been neutered, Gaddafi, a terrible man. I investigated Gaddafi as United States attorney for some of his acts, as I did Yasser Arafat, by the way, who was responsible for the murder of Leon Klinghoffer. If we could remove Gaddafi, who was useless as a threat, terrible to his own people, but useless as a threat. If we could remove these people, why are we not for regime change in Iran? Iran has taken American hostages. Iran has killed thousands of Americans. Iran supports Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen. Iran controls Iraq. We gave Iraq to Iran when we withdrew. And Iran controls Syria through Assad. Do you see what is developing? A Persian empire, a Shiite empire, and to the south, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the Emirates, Israel, Egypt. We've got a very dangerous situation developing in the Middle East, where we have a divided Middle East. And America is sitting back and not taking action to prevent it. Instead, it's negotiating an agreement that recognizes something that we've been fighting for decades, which is a nuclear Iran, which will make it even a bigger empire. So I'll conclude by saying that if this museum exists to remind us that we shouldn't forget and we shouldn't repeat the mistakes of history, let's let it do that. And let's realize that we are at war. If we don't want to call it that, they call it that. And we have to respond in a way in which we are strong, assertive, intelligent. This city has done everything it can to protect itself. The work of Commissioner Kelly, continue with the work of Commissioner Bratton, has been excellent. It is absolutely necessary, as you pointed out during your opening statement, that we are now dealing with many diverse and smaller attacks, and it requires the FBI and the federal authorities to think of our police as their eyes and ears. There are approximately 12 or 13,000 FBI agents. There are 35,000 New York City police officers. The New York City Police Department is a much bigger law enforcement agency than the FBI. And that's only one police department. And I could tell you attacks when I was mayor before September 11 that were thwarted by intelligent New York City police officers who were trained to look for what Commissioner Bratton, I believe, originally termed as the precursors of terrorism. We're going to need more of that, and this committee needs to encourage it. It's hard to get agencies to work together. We all know that. But the work of this committee under you, Mr. Chairman, and under Mr. King has really been excellent in helping to bring those law enforcement agencies together. And I urge that you continue to do that, because although the threat may not be as large as it was with Al-Qaeda, it is more diverse and harder to find. And the threat of Iran is greater than both. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, for those profound remarks. You are clearly the expert on this in the room. And I also want to commend the NYPD and the FBI and Homeland officials who have worked well together. It didn't always used to be that way, as you know, to stop these threats. And I've never seen these organizations working as well as they do today. which is evidenced by the amount of threats that we have stopped and the number of arrests that we have made, over 60 in the past year, to stop that. But they only have to be right once, and people ask me what keeps me up at night. It's a case that we don't know about. You talked about 1979. It transformed the Middle East. We're still reeling from that today. We had flags, warning signs along the way. Ramzi Youssef, 93 World Trade Center bomber, original targets, 12 Jewish synagogues, 12 tribes of Israel, Pajoinka plot, 12 airliners, plotting with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11 that eventually came back to this target and unfortunately brought the Twin Towers down. The job of this committee is to ensure that never happens again. But we have to see the warning signs along the way. And there are many today. I look at the uniform of the Navy SEAL Team 6, the man who killed bin Laden, the SEAL Team 6 who brought him down. But the threat didn't die that day with bin Laden. And I think many have tried to downgrade that it's over. The war on terror is over. I agree with you, sir. I was a federal prosecutor like yourself. These are not criminal cases. This is a war that has to be clearly defined who the enemy is, and that's radical Islamist, extremist. And only through that can you defeat that enemy. That was a great day when bin Laden was killed, but it didn't end the threat. Now the threat is evolving. The threat's different. The challenge is different. I believe this policy of containment against ISIS is not going to win the day, that as long as they can fester over there after the Arab Spring, we've seen power vacuums fall, we've seen it filled by terrorists in northern Africa and all throughout the Middle East, and as that threat grows overseas over there, so too does a threat to the homeland, because they have greater territory to launch external operations, including operations over the internet that we have seen more recently. So I guess my question to you, sir, is there are many facets to this, militarily, politically, from an ideological struggle. What more needs to be done to defeat this enemy?
Well, I think I outlined some of it, which is I think there should be considerably more engagement in the parts of the world where people are plotting to kill us. It has always seemed to me it made sense to have American military in the places that were of most danger to us, which is the reason we kept our military in Germany for so long and in South Korea for so long. I think the withdrawal of our troops from Iraq and Afghanistan on a timetable will prove historically to be a horrible mistake. I believe it was the genesis of ISIS and our inability to properly assess ISIS. I think the failure to have American troops in areas of great concern to us, meaning where people are plotting to kill us, deprives us of intelligence, because it's the military that can gain a lot of that intelligence for us, because of their interaction with people, informants, and others that they come in contact with. So I think there has to be an acknowledgement on the part of the administration that whether we want to call it a war or not, it is a war, and the military should be engaged. I also believe there should be more support for local policing, because this has come down to now trying to find the so-called lone wolf. Well, there have been so many lone wolves that it's a pack of wolves, not just a lone wolf. And they're hard to find. They require training police officers in looking for, as I said before, the precursors of terrorism. It's a different kind of training. It's very specialized, and it could use considerably more federal support and help at the local level. We can no longer rely just on the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and even the military, because not all threats are coming from abroad. Some are, some of the threats are coming from someone's home, and we need police officers who can observe suspicious activities. And we should not allow political correctness to override sensible law enforcement decisions about what needs to be done to protect lives. We shouldn't lose a single American life to political correctness.
And I think the foreign intelligence gained by the FBI and the intelligence community, combined with the street intelligence from our state and local police, working together is the best way to protect the homeland from these threats. My final question to you, sir, is from your testimony, you appear to be opposed to the Iran negotiation, the Iran deal. Why do you oppose that agreement?
I oppose that because I do not believe it makes sense to reach an agreement on the controlling of nuclear weapons with a mass murderer. I think history has proven that negotiations with mass murderers only lead to substantially more problems later. I am extremely upset about the fact that the goals of that negotiation have changed. You might remember the goal of the negotiation, including the UN sanctions originally, was for Iran to be non-nuclear. It now becomes, how nuclear should Iran be? They should not have their hands on nuclear weapons. Iran does not need the peaceful use of nuclear power. It is not an energy-starved country. It is absurd to think that Iran needs the peaceful use of nuclear power. If we accept that, I would imagine the Ayatollah and his wise men are laughing at us, that we accept the idea that they need the peaceful use of nuclear power. They are developing nuclear power for one reason and one reason alone, because they want to create an empire, which we are letting them do. They control Iraq, we do not. They control Syria, we do not. And they are basically at war with Saudi Arabia in Yemen through the Houthis. This is an enormously aggressive foe. And I learned a lesson from the Cold War. I had the great honor of working for President Ronald Reagan. And President Reagan always had a nightmare. And it's why he ended the Cold War. But he ended the Cold War by pointing missiles at the Soviet Union and by telling them he would be willing to use those missiles. He ended the Cold War by developing, or beginning to develop, a nuclear shield that was laughed at and ridiculed. It's the nuclear shield that worked in Israel. The reality is that we have to realize that we are putting the nuclear button in the hands of madmen. If the Ayatollah and the regime in Iran is not insane, it does a great pretense of being insane. To deny the Holocaust, to call for the destruction of one of our strongest allies, the State of Israel, to call for the death of Americans, to be responsible for American hostages for 444 days, and for killing thousands of Americans. I would have to say this is an insane regime. Ronald Reagan's nightmare was mutually assured destruction was an immoral way to keep the peace. Because if a madman got control of the button in either place, the Soviet Union or the United States, the world could come to an end. Nuclear arms, nuclear capacity should not be put in the hands of madmen.
Thank you, sir. Chair now recognizes a ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you, Mayor, for being before us. As usual, there are some things I agree with you on, and there are some things where we differ. Certainly, you and I have been on the same side with respect to Iran and its really terrible acts of violence that it does in inciting, in particular in the Middle East, but and to its own people. So on that, we definitely agree they're a terrible player. But I really, I've been 19 years in the Congress, 19 years on the military committee, number 2 for the Democrats on the military committee now, 17 of those 19 years being on the subcommittee that does nuclear warfare, et cetera, doing special forces. I was the chairwoman for special forces subcommittee, et cetera. So, and I know that your areas and your expertise is not in the military. I really want to get to the area where I do believe you have extreme expertise in it, and I want to elicit from you some information that we can use.
Sure.
So I won't argue with you about what's going on with the military. I definitely have a different viewpoint, but I want to talk to you about the funding that the federal government and the system in which we try to buttress what our local law enforcement are doing. I mentioned in my opening statement that I'm very concerned when I see Byrne or UWASI or COPS grants or however it is that we're packaging from the federal government into our local law enforcement the funds, and the fact that they're significantly decreasing over time, and more importantly, there's just the lack of predictability as to how those funds will flow, when they will flow, and for what they will flow. Can you talk a little bit about, having overseen this city, and in particular during the times of preparedness for your first responders, what that does to you, and what you would see as more useful from a funding perspective from the federal government?
Well, when I was the mayor, I supported the crime bill. And the crime bill was a great bargain between conservatives and liberals. And it included social programs that a lot of conservatives disagreed with. And it included the death penalty and funding, tremendous funding for local police that some liberals disagreed with. And somehow, under President Clinton's leadership, he put together a bipartisan group of mayors that included me and Ed Rendell, the Democratic mayor of Philadelphia, the Republican mayor of Los Angeles, and the Democratic mayor of St. Paul. And from that, we received money for me to hire considerably more policemen. Commissioner Bratton and I received a great deal of funding. We were able to increase the size of our police department from, I'm going to say about 34,000, 35,000 to 41,000. Aside from dealing with September 11, it helped us certainly in the massive reduction in crime, which by the time I left was 65% reduction in homicide. But on September 11, it left us with a large enough police department, although we did need help from other cities, that we were able to handle it and deal with it. But every year the funding was in doubt. Every year we had to make cutbacks and then restore. We tried to manage our way through it. I think we did. But you're absolutely correct. The funding should be, we should know what it is. We should be able to plan on it for a 5 or 10 year period. Law enforcement strategies, in particular terrorism strategies. As the chairman said, this is a long war. This requires 10 years of planning, 20 years of planning. And therefore, whatever funding Congress is going to provide and the federal government, it should be consistent. And as a mayor, which I no longer am, but if I was, or even let's say as a police commissioner or fire commissioner or head of emergency services, you should have a sense of what the funding is going to be 4 and 5 years from now. The mayor of New York City is required to produce a budget for 4 years, which I think is very, very smart. I thought it was one of the great things that came out of the fiscal crisis of New York City. It removes a lot of one-shots and tricks, and because I have to show, if I reduce now, what's going to happen 4 years from now, or if I increase now. And we can't factor the federal government in. And I'll make one final parochial point on behalf of my city. My city contributes considerably more to the federal government than the federal government contributes to the city. We are a donor city and a donor state, meaning we give you much more money in tax revenues than we get back in benefits. And I'm including all the benefits for Medicaid, Medicare, and the poor. And Senator Moynihan used to publish that report every year, and he and I would hold a press conference to show that New York City was being shortchanged by $7 or $8 billion, the state by about $12 billion. So we don't come here as supplicants. We come here as contributors. We're giving you more money than you give us back. So at least give it back to us in a consistent way.
Mr. Mayor, thank you for that. I happen to represent Orange County, California, and we're also a donor county, believe me.
I know you are. Maybe by even more, because you've become larger. And my numbers are like 13, 14 years old.
So I understand, and my people understand in particular, the fact that we are community givers in a sense, because we do pay more in taxes than we'll ever receive back in that area. Let me indulge, if you will, just one more question, Mr. Chairman. This question is about after the Boston Marathon bombings, the Harvard Kennedy School released a plan action report where it identified the need for improved guidance regarding the role of political leaders and emergency managers during disaster response and how those entities ought to coordinate. So going back again to your mayorship, and I know, and the reason I ask you, not because I don't think you're doing important things today, but that was a very specific time where you had really the largest ever known disaster on our homeland. But I know since then you've been working with mayors in other cities to ensure that they are ready and that things are going well in case there should happen to be an attack, that we don't stop in the planning stages. And so my question to you is, can you describe your role in the incident command structure when you were here in New York, especially on that 9/11 day? And what advice you would give other mayors and us with respect to emergency managers and first responders during a disaster of that type? What lesson can we bring away from that, given your experience?
Well, first of all, New York City is very fortunate in that it really isn't a city. It's a confederation of counties. We're 5 counties of the state of New York. In most cases, for example, in Miami or in Los Angeles, the city is an entity within a much larger county. Or let's take Boston. So when I had to deal with September 11, or the 30 or 40 other crises I had to deal with of a lesser scale. But since we have so many crises, our police, our firefighters, our emergency people are used to crisis. We have one entity. In Boston, the report that you're dealing with is talking about having to coordinate 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 15 different police departments. As many different fire departments, some of whom are volunteer fire departments. Maybe an emergency services unit, maybe not. So the job of coordination is much harder outside New York because New York is so big and because it is one entity. That doesn't mean we didn't have tremendous problems of coordination. But you can imagine that you multiply those problems by 10 or 20 when it's 7 or 8 or 9 different police departments that have to work together. Governor Pataki and I made a decision shortly after the attack. It was, I would say, 40 minutes. I was trapped in a building for 20 minutes. When I got out, I called the governor, and the governor and I decided to put our governments together. And we set up a headquarters first at the police academy and then on the pier, because the police academy turned out to be too small. And we made all our decisions together. I would have a staff meeting every morning when I was mayor. He would, as governor. We had our staff meeting together. And we did that for 2.5 months. And we did that because we realized that, first of all, a lot of bickering goes on between staffs that do not go on between principals. Second, there's a tremendous amount of bureaucracy in getting anything done. So if I had my commissioner and he had his commissioner and they were having a fight, we could resolve it right there and get it done and move it forward. So my recommendation is you've got to do exercises. I am a big believer in relentless preparation. We had numerous exercises in New York. At one point, we did an exercise with the federal government pretending that there was a sarin gas attack right here at the World Trade Center. We brought in all the federal and local people to see if they could work together, and we found out we knew very little about sarin gas and anthrax. And then we learned a lot about it. We did a mock plane crash on the border of New York City and Nassau County to see how they would work together and to make sure they knew how to work together if in case there was a plane crash at Kennedy Airport, which borders right on the beginnings of Nassau County. We did tabletop exercises like a possible sarin gas attack at a Knick game. How would you evacuate? So one of the things among many that I urge, and probably the most important, is a tremendous amount of preparation. Go through the incident before it happens so that when it happens, you're not going through it for the first time. And that's how I distinguish, let's say, the response to September 11, where the city, the state, and the federal government, which included FEMA, by the way, by that afternoon, were sitting at the same table. And then the mistakes that were made in Katrina, where the governor stayed in the Capitol and the mayor stayed in the city and FEMA stayed, well, somewhere.
And the sheriff stayed on the bridge, as I recall.
Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Mayor. I'm really blessed to represent an area where we have mutual assistance. And so my 34 cities, the police and emergency and everything all fall under our sheriff.
But they have to work at that.
And then under our sheriff, we fall under the LA sheriff if it should be larger. And you're right. I think one of the things we could do effectively, Mr. Chairman, is maybe to look at funding more of these exercises because people really need to go through them to understand what's
I know in Boston it helped out tremendously. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rudy, it's great to have you here today. I'd just like to make a few points at the start. One, I want to thank the Port Authority Police for the great job they do and acknowledge my friend and neighbor, John Ryan, for the job he did as chief of the department. Good to see you, John. Also, I'd like to just comment on a few things that have been said before we, as far as the Homeland Security funding, we could always use more, and there was some rough years, but I would say in the last several years it has stabilized. And I actually commend Secretary Johnson for taking a number of those cities off the list because the money should go to the cities that are targets. It makes no sense to be spreading Homeland Security funding all over the country. So this is a Democratic secretary. I want to thank him for making the tough decisions and actually narrowing it down to the cities that really do need the money. And I have to say that New York's funding for the last 3 years has been consistent. When President Obama came in, he did try to cut the Secure the Cities program, but we worked with him, and that has now been stabilized. So I would say that while there's always problems and while we could always use more funding, the fact is that over the last several years, New York has I think, been treated fairly. I guess, Commissioner Bratton later, but I do think the Department of Homeland Security has done a much better job on that. As far as the issue of the NYPD, no one has done more to stop domestic terrorism in this country than the NYPD. I know the New York Times is quoted as saying that the NYPD spies. First of all, I would rely on the New York Times for absolutely nothing. And what they call spying, I call good police surveillance. And you don't have to believe me, but John Brennan, when he was President Obama's Homeland Security advisor, said the NYPD was the model for the entire country as far as combating Islamic terrorism. And if we're talking about profiling, whatever you want to term it, and ethnic sensitivities, Rudy, you're Italian-American, I'm Irish-American. When you were the U.S. Attorney and you were going after the mafia, you went into the Italian-American communities. I can tell you when the FBI was going after the Westies, they hit every Irish bar on the west side of Manhattan, and that's where they were. And that's where the arrests were made. Nobody was going to Harlem. Nobody was going to Little Italy to find the Westies. They knew where to find them, and that was in the Irish neighborhoods. So I think we should put political correctness aside. These are deadly enemies we face. And if we cave into the New York Times and the Civil Liberties Union and these people who want to wring their hands, the fact is, under Mayor Bloomberg, under Commissioner Kelly, 16 plots against New York City in 12 years were stopped. Under Commissioner Bratton, in less than 2 years, there's been 12 plots, I believe, were stopped. And what happened over the 4th of July, what Bill Bratton did as far as stopping the threats against New York, the arrests that were made here in New York were just, again, if they had not been made, we'd have a whole different climate here today. We came very, very close to being attacked over the 4th of July by ISIS. So I think that should be on the record, and we should start talking realistically and not just talking metaphorically. Rudy, you and I went to many funerals after 9/11, too many. And we saw all the cops were killed, the firefighters were killed, Port Authority cops were killed, but people are still dying. Cops and firefighters are still dying as a result of the illnesses they incurred. I think the fire department alone, and Commissioner Nigro can talk with more authority on this, they have lost, I think, 111 firefighters have died since 9/11 from 9/11 related health illnesses. So I would ask you, again, as the former mayor who did a phenomenal job, and we can never thank you for the leadership you showed on September 11th and those weeks afterwards where you basically held the entire country together, the importance, if you could just speak of extending the Zadroga Act. It expires this year, the funding will end next year, and there are thousands and thousands of people from all over the country, firefighters, cops who came to New York to volunteer. I think 429 congressional districts have people. The importance of that being extended and the suffering that those people are going through.
Well, first of all, it's of critical importance. It shouldn't even be a question. It's a matter of duty that we owe to these people. I can tell you as the mayor at the time and going through the trauma and shock of September 11, to have people come here from all over the country to help us was enormously important for two reasons. First of all, even though New York City has the largest police department, the largest fire department, the largest emergency services components, significant presence of FBI and everything else, this attack was beyond our capacity. When I talked to Governor Pataki on the phone shortly after getting out of the building I was trapped in, the governor thought I had died. And he said, "Thank God, we thought you were lost." And he said, "Mayor, I know you don't like this, but I've pre-positioned the National Guard, and I've put them on Randall's Island." Now, why he said that was, I always resisted the National Guard in New York City for any kind of civil disturbance, because number one, I was quite confident my police department could handle it. And number two, I don't like putting the National Guard in a law enforcement situation because there are differences that they're not trained for. And I don't want to see them getting in trouble, doing something that a cop would know you can't do. When he said that, I had a totally different reaction, though. I said, thank you for getting the National Guard, and if you can get 10 more of them, I need them. September 11 was way beyond New York City. So I needed all the help that I could get. Mayor Daley from Chicago sent me police officers and firefighters. Governor Bush from Florida sent me state police officers. I got help from Maryland. I got help from Indiana. I got help from every part of the country. And number one, we needed the help. And number two, we needed the emotional support, even more than the help. We needed the feeling that we weren't alone, that we were being supported by the rest of the country. Think of it as the loss of a loved one. Your first feeling is that you're all alone, and then you have a wake or a gathering, and people come and hug you and squeeze you, and now you realize you're not alone in your trauma. Well, the presence of all those people that came here was enormously important. Many of them sacrificed their health to do that. I knew from the moment that started that this would be an enormously dangerous operation and was very worried that people would die. Almost saw a firefighter have his head decapitated by a crane that swung around, and he was tackled by another firefighter who saved his life. So these people, look, these illnesses, we don't understand. The simple fact is this never happened to us before. So at the time that it was happening, and to this day, we're doing the best we can to try to figure out what the damage is, physical and psychological. And I know people that are suffering from PTSD as a result of September 11th. It's horrible to see, but they are. And that's not going to stop tomorrow. That's going to go on next year and the year after and the year after. So I think this should be continued if we really mean that we're not going to forget.
Thank you, Rudy. Thank you for your service.
Chair recognizes Ms. Jackson Lee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much, and let me thank both you and our ranking member, Benny Thompson, for your leadership. And I think it should be noted here in New York, Mayor, that this is one of the most bipartisan committees in the United States Congress. I'm grateful for it because I certainly was not you, but as a member of Congress, I sought to come to this sacred place as soon as I could. And in actuality, I managed to arrive when there was still the recovery process going on, and became one of the early members of the Homeland Security Committee, and ultimately the department was created. We thank you for your service, and we thank those. I had my office just print out for me the names of firefighters, police officers, fire marshal, and the chaplain you mentioned, just to reinforce for America that these souls gave their life for this nation. As I walked into this place, I could not help but read, "No day shall erase you from the memory of time." And I think as members of Congress, this is something that maybe we should carry for all of our very weighty decisions that we'll be making. And I know you note that we will be discussing a very important agreement come this week. I will not choose to discuss the Iran non-nuclear agreement, but what I will say to the American people and to those that are listening, this will be a very vigorous debate with members of Congress seriously considering the security of this nation. Some of us will vote yes, because we have deliberated and believe it is the right decision. But what I want to give you comfort is that it will be a very vigorous, thoughtful discussion working on behalf of the American people as you have done. And so I want to proceed to talk about the people whose lives were lost and whose memories will never be erased, and to join with my colleague. And let me, of course, acknowledge Congressman King and Kathleen Rice and John Katko, New Yorkers who have been outstanding on this committee, and I thank them for their service, and others who have gone on. But let me again agree with Congressman King. I am a champion of the reauthorization of this legislation dealing with those who were impacted. So I just want to be somewhat redundant and ask the question, is it not imperative that we as quickly as possible reauthorize the James Shidroga legislation, primarily because of what you said, but is there urgency there? Because as I understand it, there are individuals whose sicknesses are being discovered, the length of sicknesses, people who are losing their lives, is it imperative that we sort of move quickly on this?
The simple answer is yes, and I underline that. It's important that you do move on it, and I also would like to acknowledge, Congresswoman, from our previous encounters in the past that I know the bipartisan nature of this committee, how it has always worked to do the very best that it could to try to improve homeland security. And I must tell you, just as someone who works in the field of security, I greatly appreciate what you do on both sides of the aisle and try very, very hard to reconcile differences, because you realize, as we did immediately after September 11th, that in protecting ourselves against terrorism, we're not Democrats and Republicans, we're Americans.
I have another sort of directed question, if I could. We've heard different perspectives on the funding, but I want to ask the question, the value of consistent funding for police departments, first responders having a ability to plan. And you noted that you have a 4-year budget here, and therefore you'd be willing to do that. As I do that, I can't leave out my city of Houston. Everyone has mentioned their area, and I want to bring greetings from the former mayor of the city of Houston, Mayor Lee P. Brown, who was a commissioner here in New York that many of you know and served very ably. To note that Houston was one of the cities rumored on that day, primarily because of the energy resources that were there. But the consistency of funding, how important is that?
It's very important. You know, it's like in business. Most people in business will tell you what we need to know is what we're going to get or not get, and then we can make plans. And since budget in New York City is an enormously complex process, it's now a I believe, $8 billion budget, almost double the size it was when I was mayor. Consistency is enormously important. In other words, knowing what you can count on, so then you can go figure out how to make up the difference somewhere else.
One last quick question, Mr. Chairman, if I could, and I'd like to submit into the record, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to combine a question to the mayor. H.R. 2795, Mr. Mayor, it's a bill that I've introduced called the Friends Act, which is to assess the impact on first responders of the concerns regarding their families when they are being called off and may spend long days and hours away. The responsibility of the Homeland Security Department to look into resources for the families of first responders while they're engaged in fighting the war on terror, on the incident or the impact of war on terror. I'd like to submit this into the record, H.R. 2795.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And Mr. Mayor, then let me follow up my question on that. Maybe you, as I said, this bill deals with the idea of not leaving these first responders burdened with what is happening to my family, that we should have some sort of response plan for families left behind while they are. And so I'm going to ask you, well, that's a valuable thinking that we should engage in. But I want to raise this point. As I started out, I indicated that this place, this hallowed ground, was very moving to me as I walked in. I wanted to take a moment to honor the thousands of victims on this hallowed ground and those in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, in the Pentagon, of which those of us who were in Congress at that time, Mr. Mayor, actually were there and saw as the plane came down on the Pentagon. It's a very real vision in our minds and our psychic. And to acknowledge those military personnel as well who went forward into battle after this time. As I note this particular hearing title, it does sort of throw us into the arms of fear somewhat, and I want to end on celebrating the bravery and the sacrifice of those who lost their lives. And I would like to, because you have said that any moment we are subjected to the possibility of a terrorist act anywhere in the United States where the bad guys think that they can make a statement to the world about our democracy and our peace. So I'd like you first to comment on the value of trying to think about the families of first responders, and then second, I'd like you to think about what I think you're proud of, is that New York City is a hallmark of resiliency and how it rebuilt itself from devastation. in that, how we should be, I guess I'm wrapping three questions, how we should be concerned about homegrown terrorism with the attitude that we stigmatize no race, no group, but we are conscious about that potential. So the Friends Act, which is about the families, the resiliency, and then homegrown terrorism.
Well, the Friends Act makes a great deal of sense, Congresswoman. The reality is that the families suffer sometimes more than the responders. I've found, not just in September 11, but with the loss of almost 50 firefighters and police officers before September 11, yes, that the men and women who are engaged in the activity have the adrenaline and the sort of satisfaction of doing what it is they believe they can do best. It's the families that are left behind to suffer. And I come from a family with 4 uncles who were police officers and 1 who was a firefighter, and he had been seriously injured twice. And I know how devastating that was on my family. And when you get a big incident like this is something where there should be support for the families. I am very glad you mentioned the word resiliency, because I am enormously proud of the following fact. There are twice as many people that live in this area of New York today than before September 11. On September 11 and in the days after September 11, we weren't sure anybody was going to return here. The people who lived here had to be moved out. The businesses had to be moved out. Thank goodness to 2 companies, Merrill Lynch and American Express, who made clear immediately they would return. Other companies, I would have to spend enormous amounts of time on the telephone and in person, begging them, pleading with them to come back. And this went on for some time. And I don't think we ever thought we'd be able to get it back even to where it was. But to demonstrate the resiliency of New Yorkers and Americans, there are twice as many people living here today than before September 11. They fully recognize that this is a target, but they also realize that you have to have life go on, and you can't let these terrorists terrorize us. Right?
Absolutely.
A defense to terrorism is resiliency.
Absolutely.
And it's a more subtle defense, but a very, very important one. And the resiliency of New Yorkers has been, I think, a real model for which the people who live here should get great, great credit. And this is a very vital community. It has little leagues. It has soccer leagues. This has become a community. 20 years ago, this was purely, as you know, offices. This was Wall Street, and Wall Street moved to Midtown, really. And this has become a mixed business, residential community. It's one of my most vital. And unfortunately, it's starting to get too darn expensive for a lot of people. But that's what happens. The second thing is, thank you for mentioning the bravery of the firefighters and police officers. The September 11 Commission, who, when they concluded with their recommendations and conclusions, made some very helpful observations, some laudatory, some critical, all very helpful. But one of the things they pointed out was that the New York City Fire Department saved 98% of the people they were capable of saving. And I would like this committee to know that the first estimate that I was given of the number of losses was 12,000. It was the first number. By the end of that day, when I was asked the question, how many casualties do you think you had? The number that I had from all of our sources was 6,000. And that's why I said, I didn't mention a number, and I said, it's just too much for us to bear to talk about that right now. Turned out to be less than 3,000. That's a terrible number, and it's the worst domestic attack in our history. But the reason it wasn't 12,000 or 6,000 is because the firefighters and the police officers stood their ground. Even when they were given an evacuation order. An evacuation order to a New York City firefighter means, or police officer, I leave when all the civilians are gone, which means they were the last ones to leave, which is why so many of them died. But I can't tell you how many people come up to me, including outside the United States, who were in this building that day and thank me. And you know what they say to me? Thank you for your firefighters, because if they hadn't remained calm, we could have lost more people in the evacuation than we lost in the attack. Now, I'm not sure that's true, but they believe that. But we know of many evacuations that are chaotic and that lead to death during the evacuation. This was not a chaotic evacuation. This was an orderly, very well handled evacuation. And it only was that because these men and women gave up their lives. And that is a source of, I think, tremendous strength for America. Imagine if the headline the next day, in addition to the fact that this was the worst attack in our history, was it also was characterized by firefighters and police officers who ran away. Can you imagine how that would have affected the morale of the United States? And how different was it that the headline the next day was about a terrible attack, but also stories of incredible bravery on the part of the fire department, the Port Authority, the police department, and also single individuals like from Morgan Stanley and others who played the same role.
Thank you very much. We are not allowing terrorists to terrorize us.
Absolutely right.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. We have 8 members left for questions. We have a second panel. I'm going to have to strictly enforce a 5-minute rule. With that, I recognize Ms. Miller.
Thank you. I appreciate you enforcing the 5-minute rule. Mr. Mayor, and I say that with the highest degree of respect, because sitting here today in this place, in this sacred place, and having the opportunity, it was my first time to be here last night, and Joe gave us a tour of this facility, and every American thinking about where they were on that day. I think everyone, we were all talking about where were you, what happened, what your thoughts were, etc. But when we think about, one of the things I think about then is that you, not being just the mayor of New York City, you were America's mayor at that time. You became America's mayor. And the entire world looked to you for your news conferences so we could figure out what was happening. We said, well, here's Rudy. He'll tell us what's going on. We were listening to you all the time. And so being here today in this place and listening to you and your thoughts and remembrances are certainly a bit overwhelming, as some other members have said, certainly emotional. But I think I'm going to go right to picking up a little bit what you just talked about, the 9/11 Commission and some of the recommendations they made. Because really, one of the things that, as you said, it didn't start on 9/11, but I think many people realize that we are facing such a different enemy than our country has ever faced before. And the battlefield has changed. You don't see now over on this hill where everyone's got the same kind of uniform where you can immediately identify them. No, we're facing cockroaches, cowards. It's an asymmetrical battlefield in urban settings now. And who responds? Not the military in many cases, right? It is the first responders that are responding all over the country when there are things, whether it just happened in Chattanooga, various things that have happened here. But one of the key recommendations, I think, that came out of the 9/11 Commission was they said there were so many of the different agencies that were stovepiping their ability to communicate to one another. Really, the inability to communicate. And I think, certainly I've heard you speak on many occasions about some of the handicaps that you had here and the inability to communicate properly with one another. And the 9/11 Commission said, we need to go from the need to know to the need to share. the need to share information from all various agencies, and yet we still learn some of the lessons. You mentioned about the Boston marathon bombings there, where really, and we had a hearing on this, you know, you've got 13,000 FBI agents across the country. As you mentioned, there's 35 police officers here in New York City alone. One thing about the street talks, and the ability to have law enforcement gather the information, share the information, and from our best intelligence in our country to make sure it gets down to the boots on the grounds and having interoperability, et cetera. So I guess I would just like to have you expand a little bit on how important it is to have the ability, interoperability, the ability to communicate, the most simple thing in human behavior, communication, and how important it is and for the federal government's role in making sure that we get the resources out into the first responders, that people can talk to one another about what's coming, what's happening, God forbid, when there is some other attempt, attack, what have you.
Well, I'll be very brief because I think Commissioner Bratton can give you more details on this, because both here and in Los Angeles, he was in the forefront of developing criteria that you use to try to identify terrorists. Well, it's all well and good to have that criteria or precursors of terrorism, and the New York City Police Department utilizes it, but I'm not sure that's being done all over the country. And it needs to be done, because as we've now found out, although New York is a big target and the main target, I think we're now turning into a situation where there are many targets. And with these lone wolves or smaller groups of terrorists, I think we're going to see smaller towns and more isolated places attacked. And in a way, that produces its own kind of fear, like you're not safe anywhere. And therefore, this committee, I think, could play a very useful role in helping the Department of Homeland Security in, I think, what one of its main missions is, which is to make sure that every police department, every fire department, every emergency services department in the United States has at least a basic ability to deal with spotting terrorists, identifying terrorists, and then how to react if it happens. And I very much appreciate your description of them as cockroaches, because that's a great example of the difference. These people are emerging from the ground, and it's the police officers that patrol the streets who have the most knowledge of the ground. And sometimes it's the police officers who can interpret the intelligence better. There was one incident during September 11 when it took me 4 hours to get the information from the federal government that I needed for my police commissioner and police department to interpret. And I wanted the words. They had increased the threat on New York, but they wouldn't give us the words that we used. And I finally was able to impress on, well, I won't say who in Washington. I think I said something like, I might cancel the World Series. Because I wanted the words. Now, why did I want the words? I wanted the words because if I could share that with my police department, the words, which may mean nothing to an analyst in Washington, might give a hint to my police officers that it's a bridge, a tunnel, a building that's going to be hit. Because they may understand something in the language because they know the city. The analyst in Washington doesn't know the city, but our cops on the street know the city. And one of the excuses I was given was, we don't share information like this with local law enforcement because local law enforcement leaks. To which, even though it was shortly after September 11, I just laughed and said, you're talking to somebody who was a federal prosecutor for 17 years, and don't tell me the FBI doesn't leak. Ha! So my department doesn't leak any more than the FBI. And we're not going to leak this information because we know how critical it is. And we don't have time to worry about leaks because If you give it to me now, it can be actionable information. Otherwise, I'm going to read about it 4 days later in the New York Times anyway. So you might as well give it to me. And your committee can perform a very useful function in breaking down that barrier. The protection against these cockroaches are our local police. But they need to get information in order to know what to look for. It's not just give information. They need to get information. And these joint terrorism task forces are quite an effective way to do that. And I would really consider expanding them.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And the World Series went forward, and the president threw a perfect strike, as I recall, right?
As challenged by Derek Jeter.
Chair recognizes Mr. Vella.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing in these solemn grounds. I think as we go back to Washington, it's important to go back there and with the perspective of knowing that what happened here was such a tragedy, and that we owe it to our country to honor those who fell and who lost their lives. And thank you for your compelling testimony, Mayor, and thank you for reminding us how this area has flourished since 9/11. On 9/11, I was under a court order to take a deposition in New York City about a week later. And you can't live too much further away if you're an American than I do, because I'm from Brownsville, Texas. And opposing counsel and I had to make a decision because there weren't too many flights going out. So we decided to drive. And it took us 3 days. And I remember when I got here, it wasn't the New York City that I was used to visiting. I remember how quiet it was. I remember the dust. I remember just how gray it was. And then several years later, I stayed at the very hotel across the street that we stayed in last night. And I remember thinking to myself, I'll never stay here again, because by that time the jackhammers had come back and they were starting to rebuild. And then last year, at the invitation of Congressman Crowley, my friend from Queens, I had the pleasure of touring the new Freedom Tower. I was on the 64th floor, and the Port Authority gave us a tour. And I remember being on that top floor and thinking to myself, what a great tribute it was to the people of this city to be rebuilding. And of course, here we are today. But at the end of the day, the most important thing about this hearing is that we, the American people, owe the people of New York a great deal of gratitude for rebuilding and for honoring the people that died here that day. I'm going to limit my questions. I've got two questions, and I'm going to limit them to this. And that is, we talked about the diversity of the threat that we face today, because it's not just in New York, it's all over this country. And I'm curious about what your assessment is. We know how prepared the city of New York, through federal, state, and local cooperation, is to deal and prevent these threats, 16 in the last several years. What is your assessment of how other places around the country are prepared to prevent those threats?
Well, first of all, Mr. Vella, may I say that September 11 brought us together much closer than a country has ever been for about two or 3 months. No Democrats, no Republicans, no liberals, no conservatives, just Americans working together. But I can tell you, in New York, opposing counsel would never be able to drive in the same car to Brownsville, Texas, without beating the heck out of each other.
Well, we did drive separately.
Oh, okay. Now I got, okay. Because I know lawyers aren't affected by any of this. But may I just interrupt for 1 second to suggest to you that one of the funding things you should consider is funding this as a national museum. There's a bill pending to do that. And this really should be a national museum, because it affected the whole nation. And I would just like you to know how important I believe that is, that this be funded as a national museum.
Well, we'll take that back to our committees of interest.
I'm sorry, the rest of the question?
Yeah, I was curious what your assessment is of how other communities and other regions are.
It's very mixed, to be honest. It's in my ability to get around and talk to the police, and I travel a great deal. Some communities are, some cities and counties are tremendously well prepared, and some are not well prepared. And I've always thought that the mission of the Department of Homeland Security is to get every place in America ready, and to sort of set a standard that every community should reach. I mean, everyone should understand anthrax and sarin gas and biochemical or biological agents and how to detect them. And that's a function that the Department of Homeland Security should monitor. The present head of the Department of Homeland Security was one of my assistant U.S. attorneys, and I have great respect for him, and I think he's doing a very good job of trying to do that. And any assistance you can give him in that regard, I think, would be enormously important. I think we have to think of the fact that although New York is a major target, as is D.C. or Los Angeles, or these new terrorists, let's call them that, might be thinking, let's attack them in places of less resistance. Let's look for...
Like Chattanooga.
Like Chattanooga. And therefore, what that means is a tremendous burden on the Secretary of Homeland Security and the Homeland Security Department to get a lot of departments that wouldn't necessarily face a lot of emergencies up to speed. And I think your encouragement and sensible funding of that, working with Jay Johnson, could be a very important thing, because it's something he understands and it's something he's trying to do.
Thank you.
Mr. Katko is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mayor, on 9/11, I remember standing in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Syracuse, where I was an organized crime prosecutor, and watching the events unfold, and it left an indelible impression on me. What also left an impression on me was your leadership that day, and your leadership in the days and months thereafter. I think you had a profoundly positive effect on our country, and I thank you for that. Since that time, I've watched you gain even more experience and more knowledge on the whole terrorist threat globally and with respect to the United States. And as I see it, the threat matrix has changed. Back in 9/11, people came to this country to attack us. And now we have the phenomenon with ISIS, where people within this country of ours, American citizens, are being implored to take up arms against the country, go blow up something, go shoot something. It's a very different threat matrix now. And I'd very much like to have your impression on what you think is the best way to attack it. You kind of touched on it with respect to the violent extremism and how it's branching out to different areas. It's not necessarily centered in one city right now, or New York City, for example. The biggest thing that I'm concerned about now is how do you counter that violent extremism in the communities? One of the things I think we need to focus on is in those communities nationwide where you see people who might become radicalized. What do you do? How do you go about fighting it? How do you go about interceding before somebody who's drifting in the wrong direction does something terrible? And I'd like to hear your input on that.
Well, first of all, the idea that there would be lone wolf attacks or attacks that were self-generated, 2, 3 people who were natives of the country doing this. In a way, our government, starting about a year ago, was acting as if this was a big surprise. Bin Laden wrote about this in 1997. And some of his surrogates encouraged this in 1998 and 99. Gosh, it happened in London in 2005. Those were homegrown terrorists. I don't know why we're so far behind all the time. And
again, we're not heeding the warnings.
Yeah. I mean, I was 1 block away from the first bomb that went off on the Liverpool station with exactly the same police officer who was with me and got me out of the building I was trapped in, which is a heck of a coincidence, and it stopped getting me invited anywhere for about 5 years. But if I recall correctly, all 4 of those bombers were citizens of the UK, and 2 of them were born there. So, I don't know, I would think we would have started then saying to ourselves, this is a threat. Well, okay, finally in the last year we recognized it. And it does require a different law enforcement strategy, and it requires a different military strategy. It requires, as I said, the use of the police in a much more energetic way and a much more informed way as our eyes and ears. It also requires something that is controversial, but it's true. It requires understanding there's an organizing principle. These are not singular acts of crime like, the shooting that took place in Brooklyn the other night at the West Indian Parade, or a shooting that might take place in Chicago, or a shooting that might take place here or there, whatever. There's an organizing principle, much like the mafia was an organizing principle. A mafia murder in New York was different than a murder in New York. The mafia murder in New York had an organizing principle behind it, and these attacks have an organizing principle behind it. It's called their interpretation of how Muhammad taught jihad, in which Islamic scholars could have great debates. One interpretation of jihad is to remove or subjugate the infidel. This comes out of Islamic literature. Many Reform Muslims reject it, but some Muslims accept it. So there's an organizing principle here. If we act in a state of denial out of political correctness, that this is the organizing principle, then we're going to miss a lot of these situations, because that helps to give us some of the criteria that we're looking for, that some people think should be ignored. So the reality is we need to train our police. We need to realize that the organizing principle here is jihad and their interpretation of it. That means we look in the places where that's going to be taught and exploited. Social media, unfortunately mosques, certain groups that are more extremist than others, and that we somehow say the words Islamic extremist terrorists and not be condemned as bigots for saying it. Congressman King made a reference to the mafia. When I indicted the first group of mafia members in New York and referred to them as the mafia, I had a demonstration in front of my office by the Italian-American Civil Rights League. The Italian-American Civil Rights League was founded by a man named Joe Colombo, who was the head of the Colombo crime family. And I also found out something I didn't know. In the Justice Department manual, it was improper to refer to a group as the mafia. I could have been penalized. And you know they love to penalize in the Justice Department.
Oh, yes, I was there for 20 years.
Yeah.
I understand that.
I had actually violated a rule of the Justice Department in using the word mafia. And I said, well, punish me, because there is a mafia, and it has an organizing principle. You know what that principle is? Being Italian. That's the principle. And when there were a bunch of car thefts in southern Brooklyn, I didn't go look for Hispanics or Asians or blacks. I went and looked for Italian kids because they were doing all the car thefts. That was profiling. But if I hadn't profiled, I wouldn't have caught them. There are two kinds of profiling. Profiling based on hard facts that lead you to the criminal or criminal group or criminal enterprise here, jihad, or profiling just for the purpose of harming some particular group that is doing nothing wrong. So I think we've got to define this word carefully. And I think that political correctness has cost us lives. I do not think the attack at Fort Hood would have occurred if we had not been applying political correctness. And I think those brave people would be alive today. I think they died because of political correctness, because no one was paying attention to what was being written by the captain, in which he was predicting what he was doing. In fact, he was promoted, even though his colleagues were saying that he had become a very extreme, erratic, and a big exponent of jihad. I think he was not penalized and promoted because the people in the military were afraid that they'd be accused of picking on people of a certain group.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Ms. Rice is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mayor, given your service as mayor to this great city of ours and your professional work since that time, how prepared do you think New York and this country are to handle a large-scale cyber attack that is probably one of the more inevitable attacks that we have to look at, in your opinion?
Not as well prepared as we are for the more traditional attacks. New York City is, and again, Commissioner Bratton I would defer to, and he can explain it, but from a long time ago, New York City has constantly increased under different commissioners its response to terrorism. New York City Police Department is doing a lot of work, as is the FBI, in cyber security. But as a nation, we are way behind in cybersecurity, way behind, because it can't be solved by the government alone. American businesses have to spend a lot more money protecting themselves than they do. If you're the CEO of a large company that's publicly traded, your expenditures for cybersecurity come out of your profit and loss. It means $1 million, $10 million, $100 million, and you show less profit in that quarter. And there's no countervailing benefit that you get for it. It isn't like hiring 50 people and they're productive and you can put something on the other side of the column. And American businesses, number one, have not spent enough time or money on developing cyber security. And number two, the methods and techniques that we use in many cases are contradictory. Not everyone works with each other. People don't want to share intellectual property. There are many problems in the area that you're talking about. that have not received the same attention that the other things we talked about earlier, the physical security, and that could be an area where this committee could play a big role in encouraging not only our government, as we saw the vulnerability of the Internal Revenue Service. My goodness, that's frightening. It's absolutely frightening that someone can come in and get documents from the Internal Revenue Service. So I would say that's an area maybe where this committee should put some really great emphasis. One of the big mistakes we make, I think, is we prepare for the next attack as if it's going to be the same as the last attack. And what they're trying to do is trying to figure out some kind of new attack. And I think we've been forewarned about cybersecurity, so I'm very glad you brought it up. And I think it's something that should be given a great deal more attention by both the government and the private sector.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank the gentlelady. Mr. Hurd is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this. And Mr. Mayor, thanks for being here today and your leadership during a difficult time. And I'd also like to thank the City of New York for hosting us. I'm from Texas, and Texans and New Yorkers have a lot in common. You know, we're proud of our heritage. We have a bunch of great accents, and you know, we're not afraid to fight for our country. This is the second time I've tried to be here. The first time I tried to come to this great facility, there were so many people here, it was hard to get into. And so that warms my heart to know that there are many folks that are not going to forget what happened on those days of September 11th. This is special to me because I spent 9 years as an undercover officer in the CIA. Mr. Mayor, you talked about Yemen. The day I left San Antonio, Texas to start training in the CIA was the day of the coal explosion. And you know, we did not take seriously what our enemies were saying then. You alluded to that in your opening remarks. We weren't taking seriously what was being said in the late 80s either. And it's unfortunate, I'm nervous that we're not going to take seriously, or we're not taking serious enough, some of the concerns that we're hearing all over the world from our current enemies. I've chased Al-Qaeda all over the world, in India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. They're a real threat. ISIS's ability to leverage social media is shocking. But one of the things that we have to do is we have to stop it in where they live. And you know, since you've been out of elected office, you've been a leader in emergency preparedness, public safety leadership during crisis. You've been described as turning an ungovernable city into one of the worldwide examples of good governance and an effective management. And you have done deals all over the world. So I'm going to refer to you as a deal maker. And I have two questions, one on ISIS, one on Iran. What else should we be doing in these places like Syria, in some of these cities, to help them stop this fight, stop this scourge in their tracks? And number two, my second question on Iran, as a deal maker, usually when you do a deal, people benefit on both sides of the deal. And I'm still having a difficult time figuring out how the United States benefits from this Iranian deal. And I'd love your insights on that.
Well, on the second, I would refer you to Donald Trump. Art of the deal. He would probably give a much more interesting answer that would get you much more coverage for this committee. But on the second question, I think we were completely out-negotiated. If you just go back and look at what the premise of this negotiation was supposed to be, we lost on all those points. This all began, 10 years ago with UN resolutions that Iran would be non-nuclear, that it wouldn't have any nuclear power. For the reason that I stated, you would have to be an idiot to think they need nuclear facilities in a country that's oil-rich and natural gas-rich. They don't need the peaceful use of nuclear power. So the premise of the original resolutions was a non-nuclear Iran. we gave that away with a preliminary agreement when we began the negotiation with how nuclear should Iran be. So what do we get back for that? The release of prisoners, an Iran that is going to give up being devoted to the destruction of Israel, an Iran that's going to give up being devoted to the death of Americans, an Iran that's going to stop funding Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and about 12 other groups that don't even have names yet. We didn't get anything back for that. Then we were going to have the Ronald Reagan trust but verify. Well, we're just trusted. We're not verifying. First of all, we're consigning it to the IAEA. The IAEA was fooled twice by Iran before, in 2003 and 2005. The Fordo facility, I've forgotten the names of the other, actually 3 facilities discovered by the MEK that the IAEA missed. I'm sorry, I wouldn't trust them. I'm a baseball fan. 3 strikes and you're out. Trust but verify to Ronald Reagan meant we verify. We, the U.S., we go in and we make sure that they're not hiding nuclear material like they did before. If anybody took the time to read Rouhani's memoirs, the reform Prime Minister of Iran, Rouhani brags in his memoirs that he fooled us twice before. He brags about it. It's astounding to me that we're trusting him. And then we're giving them 24 days. Which, by the way, as a lawyer, having read the agreement, I could probably extend it to 6 months because you can appeal. And it's not us that raises the objection, it's the IAEA, who got fooled twice before, actually 3 times before. I'm trying to figure out what we're getting out of this. We're getting out of this the promise that they're not going to become nuclear for 10 or 15 years. If you believe that, there is a bridge right near here I'm willing to sell you. So as a deal maker teaching deal making 101, I would give us an F. But that's no different than our reset of our relationship with Russia when we gave up the nuclear defense of the Czech Republic and Poland. And what did we get in return for it? How about nothing? I would not sell my house for nothing. I would get something in return. Maybe if we had stuck to the nuclear defense of the Czech Republic and Poland, Crimea may never have happened. So I see a one-sided deal completely in favor of Iran, and I see, worse than that, an Iranian empire developing.
Thank you,
with
sir.
Iraq and Syria and Yemen.
Thank you.
Mr. Ratcliffe is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman McCall, for holding this hearing at this hallowed ground where nearly 14 years ago to the day, America did look directly into the face of evil, an evil that took from us thousands of innocent lives in the most senseless and cowardly act of terrorism that the world has ever known. The evil of radical Islamic extremism changed the world that day. It changed the lives of everyone here in this room. For me personally, it compelled me to become a terrorism prosecutor and later the U.S. attorney. And for that reason, I know all too well what the radical Islamic terrorists remain capable of today. They will not stop. They will not relent. They will not give up in their quest to destroy the American way of life. We're here today in recognition of the fact that we therefore must remain ever vigilant of the threat of radical Islamic extremism and those that seek to cause us harm. But here in this place, which will always serve as a somber reminder of the lives lost and a somber reminder of just how fragile our freedoms are, so too must this place always be a reminder of the heroic efforts of so many of our police, of our fire departments, rescue personnel, and volunteer citizens who stood up in a historic time of need for this nation. And I include you in that group, Mayor Giuliani. Your leadership in the aftermath of 9/11 was something that not just this city, but the entire country needed to rebuild and to persevere. It's been said and written by many that we all became New Yorkers at that time. And in that respect, you became the mayor to all of us. And I know I join everyone here and everyone around the country in telling you that we will forever remain grateful for your leadership. I came prepared today as the chairman of this committee's subcommittee on cybersecurity to ask you your opinions on that. You've given your comments and answered most of the important questions that I came here to ask. So out of respect for the second panel and respect for your time, I'll just say thank you and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Radcliffe. And let me just say two things very, very briefly. First of all, thank you very much for the compliments about leadership, but I would point out that I rested on the shoulders of giants, that whatever credit I get for leadership, there were hundreds and hundreds of people that were equally as heroic and more so than I was. And it was from them that I derived my ability to move forward and do whatever I could do. So the credit doesn't belong to me, it belongs to all of them. And thank you for your interest in cybersecurity, because I do believe that, as Congresswoman Rice pointed out, this is the great threat that we face in the future, and it's the one that we're not paying as much attention to as we should.
Thank you.
Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mayor, when you're the most junior member of a committee, by the time the questioning gets to you, you ask the member, the witness, what their favorite pizzeria is, and I already know yours. You are not only America's mayor, you are not only the mayor of New York City, you are my mayor. Of all the people on this panel, I was a resident of New York City during your mayoralty, and I very much appreciate what you've done for this city, what you continue to do. Since that time, you have traveled throughout the country for the last 14 years. And I remember calling a friend of mine from a different part of our country after the tragedy that happened right here, and told him, wasn't it an amazing feeling to see all these cars with American flags flying on them, how people have come together? And he said to me, what flags? There weren't flags flying from the cars where he lived. And some people at that time, although we talked about the heroics of people from other cities coming to help us, a lot of people looked at this as an attack on New York and not an attack on America. And this coming Friday, you and I will be going to many, many events in our city to continue our pledge that we will never forget. I'm wondering, through your travels throughout the country, have people forgotten?
Yes, some people have forgotten. But, you know, Dan, it is in the nature of just the human being that as you move further and further away from an event, like the death of a loved one, you don't forget, but the impact of it isn't as great. And of course, the closer you are to an event, like whether you're a New Yorker or you had friends in New York, or so I think it is the job of this committee to remind people of that. And I want to conclude by commending this committee from the day of its inception to today, Mr. King, Mr. McCall, all of the Democratic members, all of the Republican members. I think you've been one of the most effective committees in Congress in the things that you've done. I think you've been one of the most effective in being able to forge bipartisan solutions where you could. And I ask you, in closing, to please consider once again the legislation to make this a national memorial, because this will serve to remind all Americans when we forget. Because I think that, unfortunately, this is going to be a war we are going to be in for a long time. So we have to keep reminding Americans of what's happening, because it's so subtle and it's so sometimes hard for them to see. Those of you who have been in it in some capacity or another know it. But it's the job of this committee and it's the job of this museum to make sure that the American people remain vigilant. So if it does happen again, it doesn't happen because we weren't paying attention. Thank you.
Mr. Clausen's recognized.
Got time for one more?
Of course.
All right. First, I want to thank you for your service and for your bravery. Now, according to my economic understanding, the U.S. economy is about 16 trillion, maybe a little more. We're over 20% of the global GDP. We are the engine of everyone else's economic growth. I think you would agree. $50 billion of trade deficit, roughly, every single month. I think that if China or the European community, just as two examples, had to choose between doing business with Iran and selling product at Walmart or Target, what do you think they'd decide? When I hear that this was a bipolar decision between this deal and war, I wonder what happened to our economy. That is the growth engine for the whole world. And then, Mr. Mayor, I take it another step and say, we have a financial system, you may know better than me, how many billions of dollars just in arbitrage and hedges take place every day across continents. And the way that foreign corrupt practices law works, if somebody does something wrong and they put their money into our financial system, they get nabbed quick, correct?
Correct.
And yet, to my knowledge, in the Iranian deal, we have not used this awesome power of our of being the center of the global financial system in the leverage for the deal. I am astounded that these facts are never really talked about, and that we are making a deal that is based on verification without using the global economic leverage that seems so self-obvious. I must be missing something here. And I'm not trying to run anybody down in particular, but I think that this idea that the sanctions would fall apart is only because we don't want to use our financial system or our global economic power. Am I missing something here, or would you agree with this different take on the Iranian outcome?
I have not just grave reservations about the agreement. The agreement is, to me, frightening because we get so little in return, if anything, and we are creating an empire. We are making available to a country that is set on the destruction of our greatest ally, a country that is dedicated to killing Americans and continues to say that as they negotiate with us. We are making billions of dollars available to them. Everyone on this panel and everyone of any political party would agree that Iran is the biggest sponsor of terrorism in the world, state sponsor of terrorism in the world. There is no disagreement about that. Why, in God's name, would you give them billions of dollars? What does it mean to be a state sponsor of terrorism? It means you take money and you give it to terrorists. It means you take weapons and you give it to terrorists. It means if you are a nuclear power, you take nuclear capacity and give it to terrorists. One of the main reasons that these resolutions began was not just a fear that Iran would attack Israel with missiles. It was the fear that if Iran had nuclear capacity, it would hand it off to the terrorists that it is presently sponsoring. And we could have a dirty bomb in New York, or in Chicago, or in London, or in Paris. Somehow we have forgotten that. Iran should have no nuclear capacity. They cannot be trusted with nuclear capacity. Could we have used our economic power to stop it? Absolutely. Absolutely. And finally, when you say the only alternative is war, you make it clear that you will not go to war, which maybe would have been the greatest leverage of all if the military option had not only been kept on the table, but maybe the military option were something they were afraid of. To win a negotiation, you need leverage. We gave away our leverage when we backed off that red line 12 times, because the Ayatollah took the measure of his opponent, and he took the measure of his opponent as, I don't have to worry about a military response.
Mayor, let me just close by saying that there were many heroes that day, that fateful, tragic day, and you, sir, were the leader. You are America's mayor, and on behalf of a grateful nation, I just want to personally say, on behalf of the committee, thank you so much for your service.
And thank you very much for coming here and reminding everyone of what happened, and for your continuing work for the security of our country, which I think is just about the best in the United States Congress. Thank you.
In the interest of time, we'll move to the second panel. Quickly introduce the next panel. First, we have Commissioner William Bratton, currently serving as the 42nd Police Commissioner of the City of New York. He previously served as Commissioner of the Boston Police Department and the Los Angeles Police Department. Next, we have Commissioner Daniel Nigro, currently serves as the 33rd Commissioner of the New York Fire Department, joining in 1969. He's held every uniform rank within the department during his 32-year career, including chief of the department following the attacks of September the 11th. Next, we have Mr. Ilopi, who serves as the president of the September 11th Family Association and as a member of the Vigilant Fire Department in Great Neck, New York, where he became a volunteer in 1963 and rose to the position of chief of the department. On September the 11th, he helped organize operations at Ground Zero until midnight and returned to the site daily to assist in the rescue of the operations. He continued his work for 9 months to ensure all who were lost were returned home, including his own son, Jonathan, who was in the Squad 288. Finally, we have Mr. Gregory Thomas, served as president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, serves as the Senior Executive for Law Enforcement Operations in the Office of the Kings County District Attorney. where he is the principal liaison to New York City Police Department. The witnesses' full written statements will appear in the record. The chair now recognizes Commissioner Bratton.
Good morning, Chairman McCall and distinguished members of this committee. My name is William J. Bratton, and I am the Police Commissioner for the City of New York. On behalf of Mayor Bill de Blasio, I welcome you to New York City and to this 9/11 Memorial and Museum. The locations of these hearings could not be more appropriate. This site was hallowed by the lives we lost in the terrible attack that happened here. It was consecrated by those who sacrificed here, whose heroism here kept those losses smaller than they could have been. And it has been dedicated through the memorial and museum to a promise: we'll never yield in our efforts to prevent another event from happening here or anywhere else in this great city. As you know, in 3 days, we will see the 14th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. In those 14 years, the New York City Police Department has changed dramatically. The traditional realm of municipal policing, the prevention of crime and disorder, and the fostering of public approval was expanded to include keeping the city and its people safe from terrorism. This morning, I'll provide a brief overview of the current terrorism threat environment and describe some of the NYPD's counterterrorism measures that are constantly evolving and expanding. I provided more extensive written testimony to the committee as well. In many respects, we currently face a greater likelihood of attack than we have seen in years. With regard to crime, New York City just experienced the safest summer in 25 years. But with regard to the current terrorism threat environment, we now face multiple hazards. Known wolves and lone wolves, as my Deputy Commissioner of Intelligence and Counterterrorism, John Miller, says. Al-Qaeda, particularly Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, which operates primarily out of Yemen. It remains a distinct threat. They are believed to be the primary driver of the terrible attack in Paris at Charlie Hebdo. But we've also seen the emergence of a new virulent player, ISIL, or ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. By establishing a pseudo-state in the war-torn no-man's land between Iraq and Syria, ISIL has fundamentally destabilized the Middle East and many other parts of the world. Fortunately, its direct impact has not yet been felt here. But the important words there are direct impact and yet. Because ISIL has been far more successful than Al-Qaeda at driving indirect impacts. ISIL has shunned Al-Qaeda's model, which focuses on secretly recruiting and training small cells for the next grand attack. Instead, they have embraced a diffuse lone wolf model, which mass markets a global call for violence in the name of the so-called Islamic State. ISIL promises that those who carry out this carnage will be publicly revered on global social media. They will be remembered as heroic fighters who are an essential part of a larger struggle. This promise of valor, belonging, and empowerment has a particular appeal to those who fall in the margins of society, those who are failing at most other things in life. ISIL is focused on attacks that require minimal capability, low tech, low cost, and high impact. Because killing with a gun or a car or a simply made IED is something even those who fail at most other things unfortunately can do. Most Americans, even most New Yorkers, don't know that the law enforcement and counterterrorism intelligence communities have been remarkably busy recently. In June alone, several men were arrested in New York, New Jersey, and Boston for taking part in ISIL-driven plots being pushed over social media platforms. These recent plots, most uncovered by the FBI NYPD Joint Terrorism Task Force, range from a plot to behead a New York-based critic after a failed attack at an event in Garland, Texas, to plots that involve building pressure cooker bombs in the days leading up to New York's 4th of July fireworks celebration. This wave of arrests comes after the JTTF arrested 2 New York City women in April, women who were in the process of researching explosive compounds to construct an IED. Among the targets they discussed for their bomb plot was a police funeral for officers killed in the line of duty. I'm proud to say that I was able to meet and thank the undercover New York City police detective who spent more than a year on this case and was a linchpin in that investigation. None of these plots, had they gone forward, would have had the scope of the attacks that happened here. In that respect, today's plots do not have the depth of those we face from Al-Qaeda, even at its strongest. But while the threat from terrorist groups is not as deep, it has grown now to be miles wide, indeed worldwide, and in many ways harder to track. After the worst terrorist attack in New York history, New York City certainly proved its resilience, but any terrorist attack against this city, regardless of scale, would have a profound effect here, across the country, and throughout the world. That is why, even with the significant funding from the Department of Homeland Security and its appropriators in Congress, the NYPD continues to invest our own resources in this fight. During the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, we saw police driven back, even coldly executed by terrorists with superior weapons and endless ammunition. An NYPD team flew to Paris and was fully briefed on all the lessons learned there. Another team of NYPD Emergency Service Unit officers and hostage negotiators went to Sydney, Australia, after an ISIL acolyte took hostages in a downtown cafe in Sydney. And when ISIL-driven attacks occurred in the Bardo Museum, a detective assigned to Interpol traveled to Tunisia. The collective lessons learned from these attacks formed our plans for the recently formed Strategic Response Group, or SIG. SIG is an 800-person unit, soon to be 800-person unit, specially equipped and trained to deal with crowd management, but also terrorist threat, active shooter types of activity. We have also recently formed the Critical Response Command, CRC, which will take an interim initiative that was put in place by Commissioner Kelly shortly after 9/11 and now institutionalize it in our Counterterrorism Bureau. 415 highly trained officers, also specially equipped and trained to constantly deal with the growing threat that I have referenced. SIG and CRC are significant citywide units, an additional 1,200 officers that we will be focusing as part of the responsibilities on the growing threat. We also, within the past year, assigned 250 detectives to a new initiative that includes significantly increasing our capabilities to deal with cyber security threats, both in the traditional crime world as well as the counterterrorism world. We have, within the last month, assigned a squad of detectives to the FBI to work with them on an expanding cybersecurity initiative that they have recently created. And within the next several weeks, I'll be assigning another squad of detectives to District Attorney Cy Vance's office as he significantly expands in the financial capital of the world his efforts to deal with cybersecurity threats to our financial institutions. New York City remains in the crosshairs of global terrorism. Since September 11, 2001, there have been more than 20 terrorist plots against New York City, including those discussed above. So far, they've been thwarted at nearly every turn by the efforts of the NYPD and our local and federal partners. That partnership, by the way, is stronger than it ever has been. Under Deputy Commissioner John Miller, John, a veteran investigative reporter who was one of the first to interview Osama bin Laden when he began to make his threats against the United States, and then a veteran of the FBI, the LAPD's Counterterrorism Bureau, and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and now my Counterterrorism Intelligence Director, we have undergone a collaborative reset with the vast variety of agencies, entities, and services with which we work every day. Together, we have continued to keep this city safe. We have done so while upholding the constitutional rights accorded to those who live, work, and visit New York City. Protecting civil liberties is as important as protecting our city. After all, it is our freedom that makes us a target for those who hate us. Mindful that a more detailed version of this testimony has been submitted and aware of the committee's mandate, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to testify, and I will be happy to answer any questions that the committee and its members may have.
Thank you, Commissioner Brad. Chair recognizes Commissioner Nigro.
Well, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and all the members present. Thank you for having me here today. Since I joined the FDNY in 1969, there's been a tremendous shift in the way we train and prepare the members of the FDNY. The department's primary mission has always been to protect life and property, but in the ever-changing threat environment of a post-9/11 world, that mission has become even more complex. The department has confronted this challenge by building an infrastructure that identifies potential threats, builds a response plan, and trains members to carry out those plans. The result is the FDNY is prepared at a moment's notice to provide rescue and triage in an infinite array of potential scenarios and disasters. Not only does this ensure we are prepared in the case of a terrorist event, but it also means the department functions as a robust regional asset that can be deployed in almost any kind of disaster scenario. The value of this has been seen nationally, such as when the FDNY responded to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. as well as statewide, as when we responded to the record snowstorm in Buffalo earlier this year. These assets can also be utilized locally to prevent a crisis, such as when a case of the Ebola virus reached New York City. The FDNY was able to draw upon a preparedness framework combining training, resources, and drills that specialized units developed preparing for bioterrorism threats. This includes decontamination procedures and operating in chemical protective clothing, which as an added benefit also protects against bloodborne pathogens. DHS funds helped build and train the HazTac and Hazmat units that played a key role in the response and supported the purchase of specialized equipment and resources that provide emergency medical transport, treatment, and patient care. The planning, training, and equipment the FDNY utilizes can be applied in any mass casualty situation, whether a terrorist attack, natural disaster, industrial accident, pandemic outbreak, or biological event. This ensures that we are not only prepared to respond to likely scenarios, but that we have the training and capability to respond to any threat presented to us, expected or not. This is not a capability the department had on 9/11, and our ability to build this capability has been largely as a result of the funding we've received from the federal government. A perfect example of how even the day-to-day work of the FDNY is impacted by this training is the Times Square bombing attempt in 2010. Though first responders from Engine 54 and Ladder 4 initially responded to a typical fire call, once on the scene, they immediately recognized the threat potential of the smoking vehicle and ensured the appropriate law enforcement resources were called to the scene. They took action that day that reduced injuries, protected property, and saved lives. This type of training is happening every day in the FDNY and is essential to our ability to serve the City of New York. By investing in core areas, planning, incident management, leadership, communications, patient triage and treatment, hazmat, marine firefighting, and search and technical rescue, we are better prepared to adapt to a changing threat environment if disaster strikes. We have structured our core competencies to respond to routine and extreme events, including acts of terrorism. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak here today on this important topic.
Thank you, Commissioner. Chair recognizes Mr. LP.
Thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge behind me there's a large number of family members who lost their loved ones here that are here to listen to this talk today. I'd also like to thank the Port Authority Police Department behind me, who lost 37 fabulous guys and gals, 12 of which are still missing today. The New York City Police Department behind me, who lost 23, and 7 are still missing today. And of course, the fire service, who lost 343, including my beautiful son, Jonathan, who today 127 New York City firefighters are still missing, along with 1,113 beautiful people who were murdered on 9/11, who are still missing this very minute. I've listened to Mayor Giuliani and you folks who have done yeoman work to keep us safe in this country of ours. I've had the privilege of going around the country. I've spoken in many cities, in many states. I've actually traveled out of country, speaking about 9/11 and the importance of understanding what happened to our country, our world, on 9/11. I spent 9 months here in recovery work. I worked with the best of the best that this country had to offer, not just the police, not just the fire department, emergency people, but our civilians from every one of your states, every one. They gave of themselves. They are now sick. And it's up to you, people of Congress, to speak up and support the Zadroka bill. I heard many of you talk about the importance of making this a national memorial. It's critical we make this a national memorial, and your support to do that is instrumental in making this just that, the most powerful memorial this country has, the worst attack on our country's soil in history. It was not an attack on New York City or the Pentagon or Flight 93. It was an attack on Portland, Maine. It was an attack on Houston, Texas, in North Dakota. It was an attack on our soil, our beliefs, our lifestyles, our freedoms, by people that do not believe that. I listened to you talk about, and the commissioners, about how we protect ourselves, the police force, the military, and what we need to do. But I am very, very concerned that there is one thing that we've totally lacked in 14 years, and that's education. And I can look at every one of you, and we do not have a state in our country that I know of that has a curriculum to teach the history of what happened to us on 9/11. Not a state. I find that very troubling. We have teachers now that are 22, 23, 24, 25 years old that 14 years ago were 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, 13 years old. They went to school and there's no curriculum. They weren't taught about 9/11. They don't know about 9/11, and now they're teachers. And when I tell you they don't know, I speak in these schools. I speak in these states. The last place I spoke was Omaha, a very large class of graduating students from high school who did not know about 9/11. The principal called me up, emailed me 3 or 4 days later and said, "Lee, I have students walking in the hallways of this school asking about 9/11. What happened on 9/11? I have parents calling me up saying, you don't teach 9/11? You don't educate our children about what happened to our country on 9/11? And the answer is no. And just to drive that point home, a few days from now, on September 11th, New York City schools do not have to have a moment of silence, nor do they have to talk about the significance of the day unless the teacher wants to, and so many of them do. But they're handcuffed. We teach to the test, and you all know it. And I've spoke to teachers again throughout the country, and they've all said the same thing. We're failing our children. Continue your beautiful work. You have to continue to keep us safe. But please, when you go back to your individual states, your constituents, it's up to you to say to Michigan, to Texas, to California, we don't have a curriculum in our state to teach what happened. We can fight these terrorists all day long. We know they're coming back. We hear it from our commissioners. We hear it from you. But wouldn't it be powerful to be able to say that our young people can take a stand with this by understanding, by enlightenment, by understanding that this terrorism fact is here to stay. And one of the biggest things that we were taught from our forefathers is education, and it will solve problems. And I will end, I spoke with an educator in London whose husband was murdered here. She went back to speak about we must educate here in the UK, in London. This was a few years back. And this is an individual, just one person. And she came back and said to me, Lee, I was told, no, we are not going to teach 9/11 in the UK. We do not want to aggravate the Muslim community. I've never heard such foolishness. We know there's more good Muslim people in this world, far more. But to be ignorant that we are afraid to be politically correct is a downfall. So we do have a lot of missions in our lives, don't we? I would sincerely, I would beg you, when you go to your states, ask that question. And you're going to be very surprised with the answers you're going to get. No, we don't teach. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your passion and your advocacy for the victims. Chair recognizes Mr. Thomas.
Good morning, Chairman McCall and the honored members of the House Committee on Homeland Security. My name is Gregory Thomas. I am the National President of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, commonly referred to as NOBLE. I am pleased to bring to you this morning testimony on behalf of our Executive Board and our over 3,000 members who we represent internationally, who are primarily African-American Chief Executive Officers of law enforcement agencies at the federal, state, county, and municipal levels. Since 1976, we are proud to have served as a conscience of law enforcement by taking steps to ensure that there is equity in the administration of justice in all communities in the United States. In response to the seminal events that occurred in our country over the past year, NOBLE is proud to have played a central role in our nation's efforts to improve the level of respect between police and the citizens they serve. Whether by serving as a key member of President Barack Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, or working closely with the Department of Justice on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri, we have been an important part of the discourse that has sought to bring a fresh look to the manner in which police professionally engage with the communities that they serve, and in a manner that communities respectfully engage with the police that serve them. As steps are being taken by this honored committee to revisit important lessons that have been learned in the post-9/11 world, NOBLE is pleased to present this committee with a view from the field on levels of cooperation between federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies in their joint efforts to prevent, prepare for, respond to, mitigate, and recover from a terrorist attack. As we approach the 14th date of recognition, NOBLE would like to first offer its heartfelt condolences to the families of the over 3,000 people who lost their lives on September 11, 2001. We'd like to also thank the men and women of all the public safety and law enforcement agencies and everyday citizens who gallantly responded to the sites of the terrorist attacks, both here in New York City, in Pennsylvania, and at the Pentagon in Virginia. The lessons learned from the September 11th attacks, a day which is commonly referred to as 9/11, are many. But arguably the most important one is that there must be a unified intelligence gathering effort always in place to ensure that we can properly identify plots and plans to attack our homeland and bring those who are behind these attacks to quick and determined justice. Recent statements from FBI Director Comey that the Islamic State group known as ISIS or ISIL poses a more challenging terror threat within the United States than Al-Qaeda does highlights the need for us to keep our collective eyes open for those who will choose to act in a singular manner to create terror, the likes of which was recently evidenced in a thwarted attempt in France. This ever-present threat requires a top-level effort on the part of our federal, state, and local law enforcement officials, an effort that will be greatly enhanced if these officials are given the structure to function properly. Fortunately, since 9/11, there has been significant progress made in regards to information sharing between agencies, but in order to achieve a more robust environment that actively promotes horizontal and vertical information sharing, NOBLE believes that properly resourced intelligence fusion centers can serve a dual purpose of combating terrorism and fighting crime, therefore providing an excellent return on taxpayer investments. In their 2006 issued guidelines on intelligence fusion centers, the Department of Justice defined a fusion center as a collaborative effort of two or more agencies that provides resources and information to the center with the goal of maximizing their ability to detect, prevent, investigate, and respond to criminal and terrorist activity. Many of our members across the country either work in or have worked with these centers, and as such have commented favorably about their ability to provide a forum wherein government and private sector entities can unite to maximize available resources, build trusted resources, trusted networks and relationships, and thoroughly investigate and prevent criminal and terrorist activity. With some of our cities recently experiencing upticks in crime and with the general call for government to do more with less, an expansion of these centers can serve to provide effective sources of timely intelligence related to violent gangs, drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and other crimes that have a nexus to violence. While fusion centers have a viable place in the law enforcement intelligence communities, NOBLE strongly recommends that their work continue to be subject to periodic independent review and be held to high standards, like those previously established by the Department of Justice, for example, so as to minimize the chances of civil liberty or privacy abuses. An example of a properly functioning and resource fusion center can be found in Georgia, where in 2012, the Georgia Information Sharing and Analysis Center, was named Fusion Center of the Year by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. In addition to creating and properly funding fusion centers, Noble also urges Congress to continue to support, create, and fund programs that ensure that equipment that was purchased shortly after 9/11, like those that were purchased, for example, to properly respond to chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive threats, also known as CBRN attacks, remain current and usable by our nation's first responders. Lastly, we also recommend that a strong emphasis be put on providing objective technical assistance and support for those agencies who want to apply for Homeland Security grants and assistance, but because of their size and financial capacity, have difficulty employing grant writers, for example, on a short or long-term basis. On behalf of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, I thank you again for the opportunity to provide our views on this important and timely topic. I will remain and look forward to responding to your questions. Thank you.
I want to thank all the witnesses. The Chair recognizes himself for questions. Commissioner Bratton, you and I have talked a great deal about the evolving threat. In the days of bin Laden, caves and couriers were used to communicate. It was a different type of threat, more of a command and control structure. But we see a threat today that you talked about the Garland case, and you talked about the 4th of July plot in New York here. Many of these new threats, we worry about foreign fighters, but many of these new threats are all internet driven, coming out of places out of Syria by what we call the cyber sort of ISIS commanders, if you will, sending out directives to attack military, to kill police officers. And you, sir, I think have dealt with the majority of these threats. I think you mentioned in your testimony 20 plots have been thwarted just here in New York. And we've arrested over 60 the last year. This is a threat that I believe is growing exponentially. It's a very different type of threat, more difficult to manage because of the sheer volume. It's loud. There's a lot of chatter. 200,000 tweets, ISIS tweets per day. We did have a recent victory with the airstrike against Junaid Hussain al-Britani, who was sending many of these directives, sometimes with different Twitter handlers, sometimes in dark space that we can't even monitor even if we have a court order. My understanding is just recently now took out the #2 ISIS cyber recruiter. And that's good news, but there will be many more to replace them. So I guess my question is, and it's very challenging, what is NYPD doing, working with federal partners to rise to this challenge to protect the American people? And let me just say, I commend you and your department for the great success you have had. But again, the volume is so high, it worries me that we won't be able to stop all of this.
Your comment about the volume being so high reinforces the need for what New York has been very actively engaged in, and that's the collaborative effort with all of our various colleagues to ensure that we have seamless interaction with them. It's been a trial and error process going back to the events immediately after 9/11. As chief in Los Angeles, along with many of my colleagues among the major city chiefs, we literally had to almost use a battering ram in Washington to break down the doors at Homeland Security to allow us into the room to share information and to share what we had. Fortunately, those days are largely behind us, and in New York City, I'd like to think they're totally behind us. That in this effort, there is too much to do to be bickering among ourselves or to be keeping information from each other. And my predecessor, Ray Kelly, in the days after 9/11 and the 12 years he ran the NYPD, developed an extraordinary operation that not only would work with our federal colleagues, which was an absolute necessity, but also because of the critical issues facing New York being probably the most significant terrorist target remaining in the world today and continuing. created a very large and robust counterterrorism capability. To that end, as the threats have changed, in particularly the last 18 months since my appointment as Commissioner by Mayor de Blasio in January of 2014, we have seen the threat of ISIL expand exponentially with each passing month using social media, and also a strategy very different than Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was focused on the big event or multiple big events, which had been their practice. ISIL has gone in a very different direction, a direction that is really a 21st century initiative on their part, the idea that social media allows them to not only attract fighters to Syria, but also inspire fighters elsewhere in the world who don't have to be trained in training camps or experience warfare to conduct attacks. And you've referenced the 20 attacks that have been focused on New York City, 16 in 12 years thwarted by the NYPD, the FBI, and others. But the increasing pace, the idea that we have had 4 in just the last now 19 months, the pace is increasing because of that social media. So we're going to continue to expand our response. We're going to continue to expand our proactivity. I've referenced that just during my time as Commissioner, with the additional resources Mayor de Blasio has been providing, 1,300 additional officers added to the department for the first time in 15 years. For 15 years, the size of the department was decreasing. It is now once again increasing. A number of those officers are going into our strategic response group, expanding from 400 to 800 officers. A large part of their mission will be to train for counterterrorism capabilities. Many of those officers are currently policing the U.S. Open, running all the security checkpoints that go into that facility. Additionally, Commissioner Miller is creating a 415-person unit that will be very specifically focused on protecting sites here in New York City, especially equipped and armed to take the interim measure that was created by Commissioner Kelly and now institutionalize it, because the nature of the threat we're facing has now become so big. And we've referenced the issue of concern about cybersecurity, something whose full extent of potential harm we really don't fully understand. And I echo Mayor Giuliani's concerns that we are not doing enough there, but we are continually, with our resources in New York, trying to do more. 250 detectives assigned to cybersecurity-related investigations a year or so ago, and recently the increase in assignment of personnel to the Bureau, as well as to District Attorney Vance's office. So we are fully engaged, and we are constantly looking at the exponential expansion of the threats and the new direction those threats are going.
Well, I certainly commend you for your service. Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's nice to have all of you gentlemen before us. Commissioner Bratton, good to see you again. Used to work a little with y'all up there in Los Angeles. I'm pretty thrilled that there are so many members here today, especially some of our newer members. So in the interest of time, I have just one question, and it will go to the Commissioner. We have been investing a lot of resources. The resources that we have at the federal level, of course, we have diligently worked to help New York City. My question is, you're so far ahead in so many ways on this whole counterterrorism and how to deal with your communities and policing. How do you share that with some of the other cities, maybe some of the smaller cities that don't get those types of resources?
That's a great question. We consciously seek to take what we learn and share it. There is the Major City Chiefs Organization, Noble, that's here at the table, where continually throughout the year, but then at our various annual conferences, that the issue of terrorism is now almost always a major topic of discussion at those round tables. And below the Major City Chiefs, in most of the major cities of the country, is the Intelligence Commanders Group, an entity formed right after 9/11. Los Angeles, when I was police chief there, led the way. Chief Michael Downing has become one of the more renowned experts on this issue. They meet continually to share information, not only in actual face-to-face meetings, but through the various technologies available to us now. And then in collaboration with IACP, National Sheriff's Organization, there's a lot more effort to keep them aware of changing tactics, techniques. At the Homeland Security level, Homeland Security has evolved significantly under the leadership of the various secretaries, but particularly under Secretary Johnson. He has really made an effort to ensure that the various fusion centers, the various initiatives that have been undertaken, that we are true partners at the table, that there should be nobody below the salt, if you will, at our table, that all of us should be in a position to share. It was not the case initially in 2002, 2003, 2004, when repeatedly we were banging on the door to be allowed in, to even sit at the table, let alone be above the salt. Fortunately, a lot has changed, and we are continuing to improve our collaborative efforts.
Thank you, Commissioner. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Loretta. First, I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today, and time is short, so I'd like to focus on the whole issue of the Zadroga bill and 9/11 healthcare. Before that, though, Commissioner Nigro, let me just commend Chief Joe Pfeiffer for the great job that he's done during the time that I was chairman of the committee. Joe was extremely helpful to us. I want to thank him for that, and also for the tremendous heroism he showed on 9/11. Lee Ioppi drove home the issue of the healthcare and the fact that people are dying to this day. Dan, you and I were at Chief Gansey's funeral. I remember you spoke about 343 being killed. Well, since then, another 111, I think, have died directly from 9/11 health-related illnesses. So I'd like to ask Commissioner Nigro and Commissioner Bratton if they could just focus on the importance of extending the Zadroga bill. And also, I would say parenthetically, I think every presidential candidate should be obligated to take a stand on this issue, because this goes right to the heart of what America is all about. So Commissioner Nigro, since you suffered the most.
Well, certainly the fire department's support for the Zadroga bill couldn't be stronger. And as you stated, we might have thought on 9/11 that our losses ended with 343. We've added more than 100. This afternoon, we'll add 21 names, so the families of those 21 members will be at our headquarters as those names get added to our memorial wall. And I'm sad to say that the memorial wall we created will soon be too small, because those losses continue to mount. We have 15,000 people registered, retired and active members in the World Trade Center health program. We have more than 1,000 cases of cancer among those people. And we have many sick members, retired and active, to take care of. So the importance of this bill for us should go without saying, but I'll repeat it. I could not support it in a more strong fashion.
Commissioner Bratton.
My comments would echo those of the Commissioner, that similarly, just during my time as Commissioner, I've participated in a number of wakes and funerals for survivors of 9/11, but who did not ultimately survive the efforts that they put in at the pile and the illnesses that they contracted there. This is a national obligation, a national debt, and it must be fulfilled.
Yeah, the bill expires this year, and the funding will run out by next year. We have 35 seconds. Lee Ioppi, what can you tell us on Zadroga?
I spent 9 months in recovery work. I spent 9 months in recovery work, and I worked with the best of the best that this country had to offer. It is our obligation to support them. The fire service, we've been very fortunate, but the underlying problem is the people that don't have this. They're not firefighters, PD. They're people that came here from all over the country. If we don't support them, what kind of a message are we sending out to the rest of this country of ours? They need help. The major illnesses are cancers, respiratory, sinus, psychological problems. Those are the major ones. There's a lot more besides that. The psychological problems don't show themselves until it's manifested to the point where you realize that the person is having a severe problem. Suicides, drug, marriage abuse problems, we focused on them. We can find them because we keep track of them within the uniformed services. It's the people that don't have that support. We must endorse the Zadroga bill. It's critical for our country.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you for your service. And again, I would urge every presidential candidate to come out on this issue. And with that, the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much. I'm interested in making a little history here this morning or this afternoon, and maybe draw upon this great committee to sign a letter to encourage the immediate placing of this legislation on the floor of the House to be voted on and to get it to the President's desk. I want to thank Congressman King, Congressman Maloney, and Congressman Nadler, who've been leading on this, and all of us have joined them. So I believe the message today, besides this being a very key hearing as we lead up to 9/11, is that we can leave no one behind. And certainly those who now live or those who have passed tragically since 9/11 because of the tragic impact of that devastating day. Mr. Alpe, let me say to you that the families will never be forgotten, and I know what an emotional drain and experience that you've had, and thank you for your courage of going around to educate people. You've certainly given me a moment to raise the question, why don't we have across America a moment of silence on that day, or that we work with our students and our schools across America. So thank you for that. But I mourn the loss. It is a painful experience, and it is one that we feel deeply, and I thank you so much for your presence here. Let me quickly ask my questions to Commissioner, Mr. Nigro, Mr. Thomas, and Mr. Alfe. Let me see if I can get them all out, and then you all can answer them. Commissioner, we committed ourselves on 9/11 to not let fear or terrorism cause us to terrorize ourselves. And I would hope that you and Mr. Thomas could share in this, and that is how the civilian police have to balance, to interact, to do their duties, both in terms of law enforcement, fighting terror, and dealing with a democratic society. Mr. Nigro, if you would answer, as I came in, I could not avoid the powerful image of Ladder 3. And I paused for a moment to read that story, which is the potent thing about what history is about. To know that that captain, I believe, had to use a landline or one phone that was there, dealing with giving signals or messages down. God bless him, may he rest in peace. But the question of interoperability, if you would answer that question. And lastly, Ms. Thomas, I want to thank you for Bowles' leadership and ask you about the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act that gives sort of a roadmap for officers to continue to improve themselves as they serve us, but also the same question you might want to answer of interacting in a world where you're dealing with terrorism, but also dealing with a democratic society. I thank you all very much. Commissioner Bratton? I asked you about the terrorism, but I'll go to him first.
Certainly. It's certainly a sad story about communications on 9/11 and the failures that day. And I think the department in the 14 years since has recognized those failures and identified each one and corrected the problems. So today, in today's world, we communicate with the other agencies, with the police department quite readily. We have the capacity to communicate with one another now from all floors of these buildings, certainly in the new One World Trade Center and the buildings around them. We have hardened communications that will sustain themselves. But all of those sad facts of 9/11 and many other areas where we saw that we could improve, we have. And much of that is with the help of the federal government and funding that we've received.
If I could just interject, we have a hard stop at 1 o'clock to catch our train. And so in the interest of time, so all the members can fully participate, I'd like to move on and ask the members to try to be as brief as possible.
Mr. Chairman, if I could ask the witnesses to maybe provide the answers in writing and thank them again for
I think that would be
their very astute presence here today. Thank you. I yield back.
And I appreciate that. Thank you. Chair recognizes Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of time, I'm not sure I have a question, but maybe a comment, particularly for Mr. Alpe, who talked very eloquently about our lack of educational curriculum in all of our schools about what happened on 9/11 and why it happened and what this symbolizes here. and the threats that our world and this new generation is facing as well. And so just listening to you, I emailed one of my staff here saying, listen, I need to draft a letter to the Michigan State Department Board of Education and ask them what kind of curriculum they actually have about 9/11. I intend to do that. I might be calling you later to ask you some thoughts on that. But I think it is very, very important. Here we are 14 years later, and so many of these kids weren't born or were so young, they don't really understand it. And I think it is absolutely critical is the educational component to help them all understand it and how important what it really symbolizes, and again, how we keep ourselves safe and secure going forward. It's up to the next generation. Always is. It's just the way of the world.
We've been saying this for years, that one of the ways to fight terrorism is to go at it full force, and one of those ways is through education, through enlightenment. And if we continue down this road of no political correctness, where we're afraid to say things, that's foolish, and the terrorists are laughing at us every time this subject comes up. So thank you, and I hope you can prove me wrong, but I know Michigan.
Yeah, I really am not aware. I hadn't really thought about it, to tell you the truth.
I think we all fall into that same subject, where we assume that our children are getting the correct education when they go to school, and then we find out that we're not. And we spoke about this last night in our state.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Vella.
Mr. Ielpi, thank you for bringing that to our attention. What I think we can do for you, there are 5 of us from the Texas delegation here, and we can get together along with the other members of the Texas delegation and write a letter to our governor, talk to him, and see what we can do about that. I think it's very important. On the issue of the National Museum, I think you and everybody else in New York can count on all of us here on the committee to support that effort as well. I do have questions with respect to the streamlining of your efforts, Commissioner, across the country, but in the interest of time, I'm going to yield my time so that our colleagues from the state of New York will have time to ask questions.
I thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I've had the pleasure of being in a secure briefing with Commissioner Bratton, and upon speaking with him again last night and with Mr. Nigro, it's clear to me that New York is in excellent hands, and you're doing a great job combating, fighting the war on terrorism and thinking outside the box, being innovative, and doing a wonderful job. So I simply want to commend you for that. And Mr. Ielpi, I had some wonderful conversations with you last night, and I still can't imagine what it's like to lose a loved one in the manner in which you did, and then for you to have to carry your son's body out of the wreckage. I know it's a life-altering thing for you, and for the other families that are here today. My heart bleeds for you. Our hearts bleed for you. And going through this memorial yesterday, I saw that adjacent to one wall here is where some of the remains are that have been unidentified, and behind in the coroner's office. And I hope we can continue to support that effort. But with respect to education, I was horrified to learn of the lack of education and lack of priority given to this. We learned as kids in school about World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War. This is a war on terror, and is the greatest act of the war on terror ever perpetrated against us. And it is our solemn duty to make sure that we never forget it, because as we all know, we learn from history. So, Mr. Ielpi, quickly, I'd like to say, if you could wave a wand, what would you like to have happen to make sure that this education effort continues? What would be the best way to do it?
I have 9 grandchildren. My buddy, my son, my oldest son, I have 4 children, gave his life that day. My wish would be that my grandchildren understand the sacrifices made, not just by the people that were murdered on 9/11, the Pentagon, Shanksville, here, but the sacrifices that were made by our men and women in uniform since 9/11. That's why we're here. That's why this commission has been established. That would be my wish, that I would leave this beautiful world of ours knowing that our children, our grandchildren, are going to have that knowledge on how to make tomorrow that better day. It is our obligation to make tomorrow a better day, and that would be my wish.
Mr. Hurd is recognized.
this is why we do field hearings, right? Learning about these issues, and Mr. ILP, I appreciate making us aware of these, and any information you have on people that are close to maybe getting it done, or suggestions, so that we're not starting from ground zero, would be helpful for the entire committee. If you could submit that to us, that would be fantastic. On the night at 2:00 a.m., the night after the airplane went into the Twin Towers, I was called by my boss and said, report to the basement of the old headquarters building in the CIA office, and I became one of the first employees in the unit that ended up prosecuting the war in Afghanistan and bringing to justice some of those that did these dastardly deeds on our land. And it'll be great if this is the last facility of its kind in the United States of America. And if I were to engage my pessimistic side, I would say this is not going to be the last. But when I think about the heroism that was displayed on that day, when I think about the number of men and women in the intelligence services and our diplomatic corps and our military, and the men and women that y'all represent on local law enforcement that are still operating as if it's September 12th, 2001, it warms my heart and makes me think maybe this is going to be the last facility of its kind in the United States of America. It's important. I remember what it was like in August in the CIA building, and there was concern, chatter, something's going to happen, we don't know what it is. We weren't able to put the dots together. And knowing and then seeing what happened, those intelligence failures, one of the reasons I ended up being where I am today, to see how I can help the intelligence community. We alluded to it earlier, this idea of instead of need to know and moving to need to share. It's hard to change cultures. That's what the intelligence community is based off of. Things have changed in a huge way, but I'm interested to hear from y'all, from the commissioners, what specific things can we be doing to get more intelligence in your hands to do your jobs?
I think we're doing it. I think, as I've referenced, as Mayor Giuliani before me referenced, that the collaborative efforts that have helped to inform us to the extent of here in New York, thwarting those 20 attempted attacks around the country, the increasing pace of attacks that are being constantly disrupted, it really is all about collaboration. It is about the idea of openness and transparency between the respective entities that have engaged in trying to keep our communities safe. And good news is that we're evolving at a rapid pace in that regard, and continuing to do so.
I think for the fire department, I think Congressman King mentioned before, Chief Joe Pfeiffer, who runs our Center for Terrorism and Disaster Preparedness, works very closely with local national law enforcement, keeping our members up to date, keeping situational awareness each and every day as if it's September 12th. The department has not forgotten. The department stays alert and stays ready, and we appreciate the support that makes this possible, because these things take support, and we have been getting support from federal government. We need it to be sustained.
I yield back. If I might, Mr. Chair, just add one other thing too. I mentioned again in my statement about the fusion centers, their structure is robust enough to keep that flow of information going properly. I want to add one other thing. One of the sector that was very affected on that day on 9/11, I was the director of security for the New York City schools on that day. And we had 8 schools near the Twin Towers here, 2 high schools about 20 yards south of the South Tower. And the collaboration on that day led to us rescuing 9,000 students and staff from those schools with nobody missing, killed, or injured, because of the fire department and the police departments worked together beforehand, collaboration with fire drills and preparedness plans. And on the day of the event, the fire department's response and the NYPD's response was important for us to have those children rescued. So I will also say that it's important that the plans also include those areas of the government, mostly schools, who are designated as soft targets, but are right in the realm of what can go on depending on where they're located in your respective states.
Mr. Ratcliffe.
Commissioner Bratton, as the chairman of the subcommittee on cyber, I wanted to ask you a little bit about ISIS. We've talked today about how they have effectively used social media in a way that al-Qaeda never did to essentially create terror franchises, to create a force multiplier of the disenfranchised in our society. One of the problems with respect to that has been their effective use in using encrypted communications through social media. That's been a growing concern for law enforcement generally. FBI Director Comey has talked about it. I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that publicly and comment in any way how your police force is able to or is trying to mitigate the associated risks with that.
An excellent question. In this morning's New York Times front page story on just this issue about the many aspects of it that are going to have to be addressed as we go forward. I have met with the FBI Director on a number of occasions on this issue, as recently as last week with District Attorney Cy Vance. The concerns about the encryption capabilities being built into so many of the devices that various companies, whether it's Google, Apple, and others, marketing to their customers, and how that's impacting potentially on our ability to investigate not only crime but terrorism. But it's a Pandora's box of many issues, as we've found as we've opened it. But we need to get into that box and sort it out, because it does impact greatly on our ability to investigate traditional crime, whether it's kidnappings and other forms of crime, or the growing, ever-growing area of terrorism, and impacts on our ability to track these people down once we in fact spot them on social media.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Bratton and Commissioner Nigro, I'd just like to ask the same question to both of you. When I was the district attorney of Staten Island for 12 years, there were certain things that I didn't want the public to know about how we spent my money. I didn't want people knowing what hotels we put witnesses in. And the auditors had ways that we could account for the monies that we spent, but without revealing, for safety reasons, how we spent that money. The Department of Homeland Security funding that you receive, are there audit requirements, restrictions, things that hamper your ability to utilize that money in the best way that you could use it to protect the people of New York City?
One of the issues that we've discussed over a number of years with Homeland Security, and in fact you in Congress have some control over this, is the issue of when we spend the money and the time frame within which we spend it. That by the time we get the authorization to spend it, by the time we get the appropriate requests in, oftentimes is a need to go beyond the requirements of the law as to within what time frame we have to spend it. You want to close the books. And it's an issue we've raised repeatedly, and hopefully as you go forward, your efforts on this committee, to take a closer look at that still unresolved issue. We get, fortunately, a lot of money into New York City, and I certainly thank the congressional delegation that leads those efforts. But it is the requirements in terms of how quickly we have to spend it. It takes quite a while to get the contracts up and running, and we spend it over a period of time. So that's an issue of concern as it relates to funding mechanisms that we still experience.
Like Bill took the words right out of my mouth, because we're just recently experiencing the same issues. And it's one thing, we can sometimes purchase things if there are items to purchase, but much of it is training. And this training takes time and scheduled, and to try to fit it into a certain very specific time frame becomes very difficult. So we constantly run into that issue of spending the money within the assigned time, especially in the areas of training.
I thank you both for being here today and for protecting my family. I yield my time, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I thank the members for being so efficient on time. We have a little extra time. I want to recognize Ms. Jackson-Lee for her one follow-up question.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. It was Mr. Thomas who did not get a chance to answer the question that I'd given him. As I do that, let me acknowledge one of my constituents, Deputy Darren Goforth, who lost his life tragically over the last week. We buried him last week, and certainly it speaks to the difficulty of serving in law enforcement. What I asked you, Mr. Thomas, was about the Law Enforcement Integrity Act, but to talk about that and the dual role that law enforcement have of this issue of terrorism, but also working in a civilian population, how they balance those responsibilities. Thank you so much for all of your presence here.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So the Law Enforcement Trust and Integrity Act you're referring to, which one the Noble supports and endorses wholly, is one that's focusing on trying to improve the standards for law enforcement, that there'll be some structure, that they'll be focusing on how to conduct themselves in a very structured way. Now, again, some police departments do that every day on a regular basis. Some have challenges doing that based on their numbers of personnel and budgets, but the act itself defines some standards that are easy to attain, standards that are similar to the ones that CALEA puts forth now, the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies. But also the act talks about youth reform and incarceration, and talks about the need to look at how we sentence our youth. There are some youth who have, I guess, some events that are deviant, that are not their doing per se, but based on their mental state. The act in itself looks at that issue, particularly as it relates to those who are incarcerated for longer periods of time, as it relates to solitary confinement and the like. Now, as it relates to the events that we're going through now over the past year in law enforcement that you referred to earlier, it is a challenge now for the law enforcement community generally to focus on the regular day-to-day issues of crime fighting, but also now adding on top of that terrorism and interwoven those together. We know that the challenges that are out there now in the community are really few. There's a lot that's in the media right now. Law enforcement is doing their job properly every day. It's more that we focus on the issues that are doing right rather than wrong. So any effort we have now to empower law enforcement better with the ability to do better community policing and to have better training and have the appropriate staff, that's another issue as well, because since 9/11, staffing has waned in some police departments. Here in New York City, for example, the number has gone down. So it's important that we not lose the focus on making sure that we have the right amount of people staffed properly and properly trained.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much, and I also want to thank Mayor de Blasio for his service and all of you who are here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. King for a brief statement.
I just, what BILP did not say is that he suffered cancer from 9/11 and also still has 2 nodules on his lungs. So hang in there, Lee.
Thank you. And for those of you, I think the question was brought up before about the curriculum. Our organization, which is the 9/11 Tribute Center, I'm a board member of this organization, which I am so proud of what's been accomplished here. Our little organization, we give out a teacher award every year to teachers that go above and beyond, that talk about 9/11, teach 9/11. We gave an award out 3 years ago to a teacher that came from Milford, Connecticut. She received the award. When she came with her principal and some of the other staff members from the school. When they went back to Milford, Connecticut, they wrote us and said, would you come and help us? We're thinking of putting together a curriculum for the school district of Milford, Connecticut. Every state runs their educational system differently. New York, it's regions, folks. Milford, Connecticut, we went, we spoke. Last year, Milford, Connecticut, to the best of our knowledge, is the only school district in our country that has a written curriculum to teach the history of 9/11. They're not afraid to talk about who did this, why, and how do we make it better. So if you're interested, we are always in contact with our teachers. We will be able to supply their curriculum. I'm not going to say it's the best in the world, but it's a start. So if you're interested for your own states, Milford would be more than happy to assist you in any way they can.
Let me thank the witnesses, and let me close with this. I recently co-sponsored the Droga Act, the 9/11 health care bill. I know Mr. King is one of the chief sponsors, and also the National 9/11 Memorial at the World Trade Center Act. It's our obligation, I think, and our duty. It's a responsibility of the federal government to do so. And let me close with saying this. As with Pearl Harbor, Kennedy assassination, I think everybody remembers where they were and what they were doing on September the 11th. I, for one, was with my 5-year-old, now 19-year-old daughter, watching the second plane fly into the second tower. Realizing at that time as a federal prosecutor that this was not some random act, but rather a very cold calculated act of terrorism. And I think it's incumbent, Mr. ILP, as you pointed out, that we never forget that day, and that we teach the next generation of Americans the importance of what happened that day so that it never happens again. And so with that, let me again thank the witnesses. It's been a very valuable hearing. I want to thank again the museum for allowing us to conduct this hearing in a very historic setting. It's been a tremendous experience, and I want to thank everybody involved, including all the staff who worked so hard to make this possible. And with that, this hearing now stands adjourned.
Stay with two.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.